Alaska's boreal forests hide secrets that have puzzled explorers for decades. In these vast stretches of spruce and birch, trails end without warning. Abandoned camps sit frozen in time, and unexplainable lights flare across the night sky before vanishing. From rusted machinery left in the Copper River Basin to vanished hunters in the Kuskokwim backcountry, these forests hold a series of mysterious incidents that resist explanation. Strange sounds echo through the trees. Footprints appear and disappear, and shadows move where no one is seen. Across the wilderness, evidence of the unexplained waits quietly, whispering stories the forest refuses to reveal. This is a journey into the unsolved, where each incident exposes the eerie and enigmatic heart of Alaska's boreal forests. The vanishing hunters of the Kuskokwim backcountry. The wide sweep of boreal forest stretching across interior Alaska forms a landscape where silence carries farther than sight. And this silence becomes most apparent in the remote backcountry surrounding the upper Kuskokwim River. The region's spruce ridges and gently folded valleys create a sense of deep enclosure, the kind that encourages careful movement and demands constant awareness of shifting conditions. It was within this isolated expanse that the mysterious disappearance of two experienced subsistence hunters became part of local memory, mentioned in conversations that surface whenever the weather turns abruptly or when tracks appear in places where none should be. While no official explanation has ever resolved what happened, the details that remain have circulated long enough to shape a quiet unease around this part of the forest. The upper Kuskokwim country is known for its complex terrain. A mix of low mountain foothills, black spruce stands, and meandering tributaries that branch from the main river channel. It is a place where travel depends on understanding subtle variations in the ground, especially in late autumn when thin crusts of ice conceal pockets of water and shifting soil. The hunters who went missing were familiar with these conditions, and that familiarity adds weight to the mysterious nature of their disappearance. Their camp, discovered days after they were expected to return, appeared undisturbed in ways that puzzled those who first inspected it. Gear had been neatly arranged, food supplies remained sealed, and nothing hinted at an emergency that would require immediate flight from the area. Searchers noted that the fire pit still held signs of recent use, though the embers had long cooled by the time the camp was found. This detail stood out because it indicated a predictable routine shared by nearly all backcountry travelers. Fires are attended carefully, and their condition often reveals more than people expect. That the hunters completed their usual tasks before vanishing raises questions about the moment when something changed, especially since nothing around the site suggested distress or urgency. In the dense spruce forest that surrounds the upper river basin, sudden disruptions typically leave marks on vegetation, snow, or soil, but no such traces were recorded near the empty camp. The search that followed covered a large swath of terrain, extending across ridges that overlook the river and down into valleys where thick undergrowth can conceal movement in seconds. Experienced trackers from nearby communities joined state search teams, relying on knowledge passed through generations to identify subtle disturbances in moss, lichen, and silt. Their observations supported one of the most puzzling aspects of the incident. Footprints and sled marks were present near the camp, but did not continue beyond a short distance. Snow conditions at the time should have preserved impressions, and yet the tracks ended abruptly, leaving no clear indication of direction or intent. Weather could have erased some evidence, but historical climate data from the region shows no significant storms or strong winds recorded during the days when the hunters went missing. Light snowfall occurred, but not enough to obscure all traces of movement, especially at close range. Investigators noted that animal activity was normal for the season, with no indication of predator encounters or signs of scavenging around the camp. The absence of such evidence is important because it eliminates common explanations related to injured or disoriented travelers, both of which typically leave predictable patterns behind. The broader geography of the Kuskokwim backcountry introduces more layers to the mystery. Tributaries like the Big River, Tanzona River, and Swift Fork create branching waterways that make navigation complex for anyone unfamiliar with the region. Yet these same waterways are routinely used by local hunters and trappers who rely on natural markers and long-standing trails that follow river edges and elevated ground. For seasoned travelers to vanish so completely in this environment suggests conditions or events unrelated to their skill or preparedness, which is why the disappearance continues to be discussed among residents of interior Alaska. Helicopter searches extended across musk areas where deep peat bogs sometimes conceal unexpected hazards, though such hazards usually leave visible disturbances or signs of collapse. None were found. Thermal imaging from aerial surveys identified several warm patches that turned out to be natural features. Subsurface springs, animal dens, and areas where decomposing vegetation generates pockets of heat. Nothing indicated human presence. When ground teams revisited the area days later, they found that the forest remained unchanged, as though the disappearance had left no imprint on the surroundings. Local accounts add another dimension, not through witness testimonies of what happened, but through recollections of unusual atmospheric conditions that sometimes occur in this region. Residents of various Kuskokwim River communities have long noted phenomena like sudden fog formations that appear without wind or momentary temperature inversions that create pockets of colder or warmer air along the ground. These occurrences are scientifically documented in interior Alaska and can affect visibility and perception in ways that make navigation difficult. Still, none of these conditions align fully with the disappearance, since search teams found no evidence that the hunters attempted to move through the forest during periods of reduced visibility. The backcountry is also known for acoustic distortions produced by layered temperature conditions that bend sound across long distances. Reports from other areas of the Alaskan interior describe voices or movements seeming far closer or further away than they actually are. While these effects might have influenced the hunters' sense of direction if they had left the camp for a short excursion, they cannot account for the total absence of physical signs that typically accompany travel through boreal environments. Even a brief walk would disturb lichens, break twigs, or leave shallow depressions in the soil. Years after the incident, searchers who walked the site again noted an atmosphere that appeared preserved, as though the forest had resisted any change since the camp was abandoned. In many parts of Alaska's Boreal Forest, natural cycles of decay and regrowth gradually erase human presence. Yet certain areas remain preserved under stable conditions for long periods. The Kuskokwim country has pockets like this where moss grows slowly and vegetation patterns remain constant, creating a silent stillness that can feel almost suspended. Most investigations into such incidents eventually settle into practical interpretations, but this case never reached that point. Discussions among local hunters, pilots, and search personnel often return to the same unresolved elements: the intact camp, the lack of tracks, the absence of weather disruption, and the quiet forest that offered no indication of struggle or injury. These details linger in collective memory because they challenge the usual expectations of wilderness behavior, leaving room for speculation that has persisted for decades. To this day, the stillness around the site of the vanished hunters feels as though it is holding the final moments of their presence just beyond reach. The strange lights over the Yukon Flats. Across the broad sweep of the Yukon Flats, the meeting of open sky and slow-moving water creates an expanse where unusual illumination has long unsettled those who travel its edges, shaping a landscape that feels endlessly open yet strangely enclosed by silence. The region stretches across more than 8 million acres in northeast Alaska, lying within the state's Boreal Forest zone and known for its labyrinth of lakes formed by centuries of shifting river channels. It is here, in one of the flattest and most remote basins in the state, that accounts of unexplained aerial lights have gathered over decades, often described in passing by residents and travelers who rarely embellish their experiences. Mention of the strange lights over the Yukon Flats usually arises only after someone else brings it up first, as if the memory gains shape only when shared, hanging in the air with the same quiet presence the lights themselves are said to hold. Within this far-reaching lowland, shaped by countless lakes and wide flood plains, the environment produces its share of natural optical effects, though none resemble the strange lights repeatedly reported here. Sundogs appear here more frequently than in many northern regions, created by ice crystals suspended in the air, and the aurora borealis often spreads across the night sky in veils of shifting green. These displays are well understood, recognized by those who have lived their entire lives in the region, and familiar to pilots who navigate the interior's long winter nights. Yet even the most knowledgeable observers maintain a distinction between these natural phenomena and the incidents they describe. Reports of single points of radiance that change direction, alter height, or pause above the landscape in ways that do not match known atmospheric behavior. No technologically confirmed evidence exists, but the consistency of certain details across unrelated accounts is part of what keeps this mystery firmly rooted in local memory. Accounts from communities along the Yukon River describe luminous forms rising above the treetops with movements that seem outside anything explained by regional weather patterns. Villages such as Fort Yukon and smaller settlements dispersed throughout the flats represent some of the northernmost communities in the interior, and residents who spend long hours outdoors notice anything unusual in the sky quickly. Many who speak of the lights mention a moment when a steady glow appears low on the horizon before lifting slowly, as if shedding the weight of the forest below. Others recall sudden brightness at a fixed point that remains visible long after the expected duration of any passing aircraft. The absence of engine noise is a detail repeated often, and the motion described rarely suggests a linear path typical of aviation. Individual stories differ in length and emphasis, but the emphasis on silence remains constant. Scientific interpretations grounded in atmospheric behavior offer possibilities, yet each falls short when examined against the specific ways these lights drift, hover, or divide. Mergers caused by temperature inversions can elevate distant lights, making them appear to float or stretch above the land. And the Yukon Flats is known for extreme temperature layering due to its basin-like shape. However, these optical distortions generally affect stable sources of light, distant cabins, snow machines, or other fixed points, rather than producing self-contained luminous bodies. Ball lightning has also been considered, though its rarity and typically brief duration do not align with accounts of lights that remain visible for minutes at a time. Even auroral scientists note that while auroras can form intense localized glows, their fluid movement differs significantly from the controlled linear paths described in local reports. The more these theories are applied, the more they seem to dissolve under the weight of simple inconsistencies. Along the shadowed margins of black spruce forests, the sharp contrast between dark timber and pale horizon makes any sudden brightness appear sharper and more defined. The boreal forest here is shaped by slow-growing spruce and extensive willow thicket, creating corridors where sight lines narrow until the landscape suddenly opens into broad wetlands. Those moving through these environments describe moments when light seems to break through with unnatural clarity, as though emerging from the air itself rather than descending from above. Wildlife behavior occasionally mirrors this shift. Observers have noted sudden flights of waterfowl without any audible disturbance, prompting questions about whether they reacted to something unseen or simply followed their own seasonal instincts. Hunters crossing winter trails through frozen wetlands have spoken of lights that lifted in silence, then glided sideways with an uncanny steadiness that resisted familiar explanations. These trails often span miles of frozen lakes and muskeg, and those traveling them rely heavily on spatial awareness and memory. Several who recall witnessing the lights describe moments when a glow first appeared on the periphery of vision, prompting a pause to determine whether it belonged to another traveler. But as the light rose and maintained a horizontal course, moving with neither hesitation or variance, it took on an unrecognizable quality. The cold carries sound clearly across the flats, and the absence of noise, no hum, no rush of wind, no mechanical pulse, remains one of the most disputing elements of these sightings. Meteorological studies reveal how inversion layers, ice crystals, and distant reflections might shape certain glows, but none of these align with the distinct motion patterns described across decades. The Yukon Flats is documented as one of the coldest areas in interior Alaska during winter, with air pooling in the basin and forming strong inversions that bend light. Yet these inversions create elongation or distortion, not sustained lateral movement. Researchers analyzing historical weather data note that many sightings occurred during periods of atmospheric stability, conditions under which unusual lights might appear more defined, but would not behave erratically or independently. The mismatch between scientific models and eyewitness accounts reinforces the lingering uncertainty surrounding the phenomenon. From clearings where lakes stretch toward the horizon, observers often witness reflections that distort distance. Yet the lights themselves appear to originate above the landscape rather than upon it. The Yukon Flats contain more than 40,000 shallow lakes formed over centuries by the wandering Yukon River, making reflections a common component of the visual environment. However, those who differentiate between reflections and the phenomenon itself describe a sense of elevation. Light suspended with no visible connection to the ground or water. The clarity of winter nights only intensifies this impression, setting a stable backdrop against which any anomalous movement becomes immediately noticeable. Season after season, the phenomenon returns without regularity, maintaining a presence that endures in regional memory, even as it evades every attempt at categorization. Some years pass without a single report. Other seasons bring several sightings clustered within a few weeks. The absence of a predictable pattern leaves room for speculation, but few answers. Those who live within the flats learn to accept the lights as part of their landscape, neither feared nor dismissed, simply noted as one of the many unexplained elements woven into the Boreal Forests' vast silence. Somewhere above the stillness of the Yukon Flats, a silent glow continues to move in ways no one has yet been able to understand. The Phantom Camp near the Tanana River Bend. A fully arranged campsite sat undisturbed along the Tanana River, as if the people who had set it up had vanished into thin air. The river curved sharply through a stretch of boreal forest, and the camp rested just beyond the water's edge, its presence both precise and perplexing. Observers described neatly pitched tents, fire pits with cold ashes, and supplies left in place as though someone had only stepped away for a brief moment. Yet the absence of tracks, recent footprints, or any other indication of human passage left an uneasy sense that the camp had appeared without explanation. Locals had long spoken of temporary shelters along the Tanana, built for fishing, hunting, or trapping, but nothing matched the reports of a site so complete, yet so eerily abandoned. The combination of preparation and disappearance gave the impression of a place suspended in time where ordinary rules of presence and absence no longer applied. Cookpots rested over cold ashes and tarps were still taut between trees, yet no footprints or tracks led away from the site in any direction. Small utensils lay carefully arranged on makeshift tables, and sleeping gear remained folded as if ready for immediate use. Visitors noted that moss and fallen needles had begun accumulating subtly on the outer edges of the campsite, hinting at exposure to the elements, but offering no clue to the duration of abandonment. The air around the camp was unusually still. Even the soft rustle of wind through spruce and birch felt restrained. Observers noted the contrast between the care apparent in the arrangement of the site and the total absence of any human trail, creating a tension between natural order and the inexplicable void of human presence. Nearby tools leaned against logs in orderly rows, their placement suggesting care and intention, but the forest around them remained utterly silent. Axes, saws, and simple trapping implements stood as if waiting to be used. Yet the earth offered no disturbance to suggest recent activity. Pine needles beneath the tools were undisturbed, and the soft soil between trees held no impressions of footsteps. Wildlife moved freely around the site, but there was a discernible stillness, a sense that even the forest's usual sounds had pulled back in recognition of something unusual. Each object placed deliberately became evidence both of human action and of human absence, a contradiction that deepened the mystery of the phantom camp. Seasonal flooding of the river leaves silt and debris scattered along the banks, sometimes revealing campsites long hidden beneath layers of mud. Yet, this one appeared freshly untouched. Historical records note that the Tanana River can rise dramatically in spring, redistributing soil and altering the shape of river bends. Any campsite left in low areas is often partially buried or carried downstream, but the phantom camp remained intact, situated on slightly higher ground that would normally be exposed to wind and rain. Observers commented that even after periods of thaw and minor flooding, the tents, fire pits, and gear maintained their original placement, resisting both natural forces and human activity. The forest floor around the camp bore signs of past use. Flattened grass, scattered pine needles, but nothing indicated when the camp had last been occupied. Moss had begun creeping across wooden supports and logs, and the needles underfoot were compressed in some places, yet untouched in others, creating a pattern that defied conventional timelines. Seasonal growth, decay, and frost heaving might have offered hints to an investigator, but all measures produced ambiguous results. Even experienced outdoorsmen familiar with the effects of boreal climates on temporary structures could not determine a timeline, leaving the camp suspended in an unresolved state between occupation and disappearance. Ranger reports and anecdotal accounts note that temporary camps along this stretch of the Tanana are usually easy to date. Yet, the so-called phantom camp resisted every attempt at chronological placement. Standard markers, such as weathering, ash residue, or disturbance of undergrowth, yielded no conclusive information. Rangers familiar with the region recounted how quickly campsites can appear and vanish. But even by those standards, this instance was unusual. Its consistency across multiple sightings and reports over the years suggested an anomaly that could not be explained by ordinary seasonal cycles or human error, prompting its inclusion in informal range briefings as a case study of the unexplained. Small animals seemed unconcerned by the presence of the campsite, moving through it without hesitation, leaving no disturbances that might hint at a recent human presence. Tracks of rabbits and foxes crossed through the area, but they did not disturb any of the gear. Birds alighted briefly on logs and tent supports, yet even they left minimal impact. The interaction of wildlife with the site underscored its peculiarity. The forest acknowledged the campsite without attempting to conceal it, yet no human influence accompanied the natural occupancy of the area. This interplay of animal behavior and human absence added a layer of subtle mystery to the scene. Even the light filtering through the boreal canopy fell evenly across the site, offering no shadows or movement to suggest anyone had been there, reinforcing the eerie stillness. Sunlight passed through needles and branches, illuminating tents, tables, and tools in a quiet, impartial manner. Each object was revealed with clarity, yet none of the shadows suggested motion or recent manipulation. At different times of day, observers noted a consistency in the visual presentation. The camp appeared unchanged, as if fixed by an invisible hand, immune to the ordinary passage of hours. This unchanging quality contributed to a sense of timelessness, leaving witnesses with a profound feeling that the camp existed outside normal expectations. Those who returned to the bend later found only the same carefully arranged gear, as though the camp existed outside the normal passage of time and human routine. Attempts to document or photograph the site produced images identical to prior accounts with no evidence of alteration or removal. The location itself offered no natural explanation. No concealed paths, hidden caches, or nearby structures accounted for its sudden appearance or continued undisturbed state. Each visit reinforced the impression that the phantom camp was both real and resistant to explanation. A persistent anomaly in an otherwise well-understood region of Alaska's Boreal Forest. The forest keeps its silence, and the phantom camp lingers as a question no one has yet answered. The unidentified creature is seen in the Susitna lowlands. A shadow moved through the reeds near the Susit River, observed by a lone fisherman who later reported a figure unlike any animal he had ever seen. The encounter occurred on a quiet morning when the lands were cloaked in mist, the water reflecting pale light from a winter sun struggling to rise. The figure slipped silently among the tall grasses, its movements deliberate and fluid, leaving the observer unsure whether he'd glimpsed a known creature or something entirely unidentifiable. Accounts describe a presence that was simultaneously large and silent, blending with the wetlands, yet somehow imposing, as though it navigated the terrain with familiarity beyond human understanding. Locals familiar with the area's wildlife expressed skepticism, noting that bears, moose, and wolves were common, but none moved in a way that matched these reports. The fleeting nature of the sighting added weight to its mystery, suggesting an entity that could remain unseen despite proximity. The air was heavy with humidity and the scent of damp vegetation. Yet the movement cut through the stillness with a deliberate, almost unnatural precision. The lands at this time of year are dense with undergrowth, and small streams wind unpredictably through the brush, providing ample hiding spots for wildlife. Yet the figure's passage seemed purposeful, avoiding natural obstacles with a grace that left no broken branches or disturbed reeds. Observers remarked that even the surrounding water remained largely undisturbed, save for occasional ripples coinciding with the creature's steps. There was a rhythm to its movement, a consistency that suggested intent rather than random wandering. The unusual precision of these motions created a tension between expectation and reality, hinting at intelligence or instinct beyond normal animal behavior. Footprints pressed into the soft mud along the riverbank suggested weight and stride, but the shapes defied comparison with known wildlife in the region. The impressions were elongated, wide, and occasionally uneven, in a way that made identifying the creature impossible. Tracks were found at varying depths, indicating shifts in speed or gait, and in some areas, the mud retained no recognizable paw or hoof patterns. Soil samples taken later confirmed no evidence of human footwear. Yet, the impressions were clearly the result of deliberate movement. This combination of identifiable force and unclassifiable form contributed to a sense of unease, a presence that left evidence, but no clear signature, confounding the normal processes of identification. Observers noted that the figure lingered just beyond clear view, its posture and gait unlike bears, moose, or wolves common to the lands. Glimpses described a tall, upright stance with shoulders broad but nimble, moving with a measured steadiness that allowed it to remain partially concealed. In low light, the creature's outline seemed distorted, blending with reeds and shadows. Yet observers consistently reported a head and torso that hinted at more than quadrupedal movement. Its behavior was neither aggressive nor overtly fearful, but deliberate, suggesting awareness of being observed while maintaining distance. The combination of concealment and purposeful motion left witnesses both fascinated and unsettled, as though encountering a being not meant to be catalogued by human perception. Over the years, similar reports have emerged from different stretches of the Susitna lowlands, each describing a creature of unusual size and behavior that left no confirmed traces behind. Hunters, trappers, and occasional surveyors provided accounts of fleeting glimpses or sudden disturbances in wildlife patterns, all pointing toward a presence that shared certain characteristics: substantial size, cautious movement, and a tendency to remain near water channels. These accounts, while anecdotal, share enough consistency to suggest a recurring phenomenon rather than isolated misinterpretation. The repeated nature of sightings reinforces the sense that something inhabits these wetlands regularly, yet evades full documentation, adding to the enduring puzzle of the Susanna creature. Experts consider misidentifications and environmental illusions, but the repeated consistency of reports and physical anomalies leaves questions that standard explanations cannot fully answer. Optical illusions, shadows, and variations in light across water and vegetation can all create false impressions of size or shape. Yet, the specific details reported, stride length, body posture, and interaction with the environment do not neatly match any known species or visual anomaly. Wildlife specialists who have visited the areas corroborate that while misinterpretation is possible, the combination of visual cues, tracks, and behavioral observations recorded by multiple witnesses remains inexplicable. The persistence of this anomaly in such a well-studied ecosystem underscores the uncertainty surrounding the creature. Birds scattered abruptly, and small mammals vanished into brush in ways that hinted at a presence both large and cautious, reinforcing the sense that something unseen watched from the wetlands. Observers noted that these disturbances occurred in patterns inconsistent with known predators, often appearing in areas with minimal human traffic. Fish in shallow channels reacted to ripples that seemed unaccounted for, as though a larger body had passed unseen beneath the surface. These subtle interactions with the environment provide circumstantial evidence of a presence, and though they do not identify it, they suggest intelligence or awareness, heightening the impression that the creature is neither random nor accidental in its movement. The land's vast, interlacing waterways and dense undergrowth make extended observation difficult, which may account for why the creature's existence remains speculative yet persistent. Travel through the region is slow, and thick vegetation restricts clear sight lines, allowing large animals to remain concealed with ease. Seasonal floods alter the terrain annually, shifting channels, covering tracks, and creating new pathways through reeds and forest. Combined with the careful, deliberate movements described by witnesses, these factors explain how a large entity might consistently avoid detailed observation while leaving intermittent traces that spark curiosity and debate. Each account emphasizes fleeting glimpses, partial impressions, and the unnerving certainty that something moves deliberately through the sustained low lens beyond the understanding of most who encounter it. Observers report a pattern. The figure appears unexpectedly, remains just long enough to be noticed, and then disappears into cover, leaving an indelible sense of awareness behind. Even when no direct visual contact occurs, the ambient disturbances, animal reactions, and inconsistent tracks reinforce the idea of an intelligent, elusive presence. Across multiple sightings, the collective evidence forms a mosaic of impressions that defy conventional explanation. And though no one has captured it on film or in photographs, the creature's presence lingers as a puzzle embedded deep within the wetlands. The 1990 Delta Junction tremor and forest glow. A sudden shudder rippled through the ground near Delta Junction, shaking the trunks of spruce and birch as residents felt the forest itself momentarily breathe beneath them. It was early morning, and the light was dim, filtered through the boreal canopy when the tremor struck without warning. People inside cabins reported furniture vibrating and the floorboards trembling beneath their feet. The sound of settling timber mingled with distant groans of shifting soil, creating an unsettling chorus that seemed larger than the measured magnitude suggested. Though brief, the event drew immediate attention from both locals and geologists, who noted the tremor's unusual timing and location within the boreal lowlands. For those witnessing it, the experience was disorienting, a reminder that beneath the serene, snow-dusted forests, subtle forces could stir with sudden intensity. The tremor lasted only seconds, yet the subtle swaying of branches and the faint creak of permafrost hinted at a force larger than ordinary seismic events in the area. Delta Junction sits within a complex network of fault lines, but tremors of this size rarely produce any noticeable effect on the surface. Still, the forest responded visibly. Thin birch saplings bent slightly, their roots anchored in frozen soil that shifted just enough to be audible. Local reports noted the smell of disturbed earth, a faint metallic scent carried on the cold morning air. Despite its brevity, the tremor left a palpable impression of instability, a reminder that even in regions considered geologically stable, the land could respond in unexpected ways. As the ground settled, a pale ethereal glow seemed to hover among the trees, bathing the forest floor in a color that witnesses struggled to define. Observers described it as neither sunlight nor reflection, but a diffuse illumination that traced the contours of tree trunks and underbrush. Some noted it flickered, shifting in intensity, while others saw a steady luminescence that lasted minutes after the tremor. The effect was more pronounced in low-lying areas and along patches of snow-covered ground, hinting at a connection to the moisture-rich soils and frost-laden vegetation of the lands. Those who ventured closer reported a subtle warmth, though not enough to be measurable, adding to the perplexing nature of the phenomenon. Geologists recorded the tremor as minor on the RTER scale. Yet the combination of timing, location, and unusual luminous phenomena defied easy classification. Instruments showed no residual seismic waves that would account for the persistent glow, and geomagnetic readings were within normal ranges. Experts hypothesized potential causes from electric effects in frozen soils to electrical charges generated by shifting mineral deposits. Yet none fully explained the appearance of light suspended above the forest floor. In the absence of definitive measurements, the incident was filed as a natural anomaly, an intersection of geological and atmospheric forces that left more questions than answers. Animals reacted strangely in the hours that followed, with flocks of birds abandoning usual perches and moose moving in irregular paths as though sensing an invisible presence. Tracks in soft mud suggested abrupt departures from typical routines, and small mammals were conspicuously absent from areas where they were normally abundant. The pattern of animal behavior implied that the glow or some residual energy from the tremor had affected living creatures, though no one could determine whether the reaction was to light, vibration, or another imperceptible stimulus. Hunters and trappers in the region noted the anomalies in their logs, contributing corroborative evidence to the accounts of both tremor and illumination. Residents described the glow lingering over fallen logs and frozen streams, fading and intensifying unpredictably in a way that did not match ordinary light sources. Shadows cast by the illumination shifted independently of the sun's angle, and reflective surfaces, such as icy patches, produced inconsistent highlights. Photographs taken at the time showed diffuse, unstructured light, lacking a defined source, while video attempts captured faint streaks and patches rather than solid shapes. Witnesses often reported a feeling of heightened awareness, an almost tangible tension in the air, as though the forest itself had become attentive to the presence of the unusual glow. Similar tremors elsewhere in Alaska have produced minor geological shifts, but the accompanying illumination in Delta Junction remains a rare and largely undocumented occurrence. Scientists studying other boreal regions have recorded transient luminescence associated with electrical phenomena or chemical reactions in soils. Yet the combination of a detectable tremor followed immediately by visible forest glow is virtually unprecedented. Comparisons to distant reports underscore the peculiarity of Delta Junction, where the event was recorded by multiple residents and briefly observed by visiting geologists. Even in Alaska, where unpredictable natural events are not uncommon, this incident stands out as anomalous. Investigators noted the difficulty of capturing the phenomenon as short duration, dense forest cover, and inconsistent intensity rendered precise measurement nearly impossible. Attempts to recreate the conditions in controlled studies proved inconclusive, with no repeatable combination of vibration, soil composition, and temperature producing the same luminous effect. Interviews with witnesses reinforced the sense of unpredictability. Some saw the glow immediately after the tremor, others only as residual light minutes later, and a few detected faint flashes long after the ground had settled. This irregularity contributed to the lasting sense of mystery and made the event resistant to conventional scientific explanation. Even decades later, the tremor and its forest glow are remembered as a singular event, blending natural science with the uncanny in a way that continues to puzzle both residents and researchers. Written accounts, oral histories, and sparse photographic records preserve the memory of the forest briefly transformed, yet no definitive study has resolved its cause. Those who experienced it recount not only the visual phenomenon, but also a profound sense that something in the forest had shifted, however subtly, in response to forces unseen. The combination of natural and inexplicable elements ensures that the incident remains a point of fascination for those who explore the boundary between scientific observation and the mysteries of the Alaskan wilderness. The ground has long since calmed, yet the memory of that tremor and its lingering glow continues to haunt the silent forest, the lost pilot above the Anaiko wilderness. The small aircraft climbed steadily into a low gray sky, its radio transmitting routine updates before fading into static over the unbroken expanse of the Anaiko wilderness. The flight had been uneventful at first, following a familiar route across rivers and dense spruce forests. Yet, the remoteness of the region always carried inherent risks. Pilots flying above the boreal lands understood that weather could change in minutes, and that navigation often relied on visual markers partially obscured by snow, fog, or tree cover. The aircraft's last confirmed transmission placed it near a narrow tributary where streams carved shallow channels through moss and frozen ground. But shortly afterward, the signal faltered, leaving an unsettling void in communication that would trigger immediate concern. Those monitoring the flight knew the pilot was experienced. Yet the wilderness has a way of rendering skill insufficient when combined with isolation and unexpected environmental hazards. Snow-driven winds whipped across the treetops, and fog rolled in pockets that twisted visibility, creating a landscape in which even familiar landmarks became unrecognizable. Temperatures hovered near freezing, and a layer of fresh snow masked previous tracks or minor terrain features that might otherwise guide visual navigation. The treetops, dark and uniform, offered no reference points for judging altitude or direction, while the frozen ground below promised little forgiveness for a misjudged descent. Pilots often relied on subtle shifts in light, the reflection of snow, and the alignment of rivers and ridges to maintain course. But in the Inno wilderness, even these cues can vanish within moments. The combination of shifting weather, low visibility, and the sprawling featureless forest made the task of locating the aircraft after its disappearance daunting for any search team. Radar readings showed the plane veering slightly off its projected course, a subtle deviation that initially drew only mild concern from flight coordinators monitoring the journey. The small discrepancy did not immediately suggest an emergency, yet it coincided with reports of deteriorating weather conditions along the route. In the dense forest below, snow-laden branches and interlacing waterways complicated the picture, leaving the pilot with fewer visual references to correct the course. Analysts later noted that the deviation may have resulted from a combination of wind drift, atmospheric pressure changes, and the challenges of navigating over an uninterrupted canopy. Though these explanations could not account for the total disappearance that followed, even minor irregularities in the flight path over such wilderness can escalate quickly. And in this case, the consequences were profound. Within minutes, search and rescue teams were mobilized, deploying aircraft and ground crews who faced frozen rivers, dense forests, and the logistical challenge of reaching the heart of the wilderness. Helicopters skimmed low over snow-covered treetops, their rotors stirring clouds of frost, while teams on the ground attempted to traverse miles of unbroken forest with minimal landmarks. Every stream and river crossing required careful negotiation, and the presence of permafrost beneath the snow further complicated travel. Despite the best efforts of experienced searchers, the scale of the inner cove made a thorough sweep nearly impossible within the first crucial hours after the disappearance. The wilderness itself seemed to resist intrusion, a reminder that human search efforts are constrained by the vast and indifferent natural environment. Local trappers and hunters reported hearing an engine hum in distant, isolated sectors, though no visual confirmation was ever obtained, adding to the uncertainty surrounding the pilot's final position. Some described it as brief, like a phantom sound carried by the wind, while others recalled intermittent echoes bouncing off frozen ridges. These accounts, while fragmentary, were treated with attention, as similar auditory cues in previous searches had occasionally led to evidence of missing aircraft. Yet in this case, nothing concrete was found to corroborate the sounds, leaving them as tantalizing hints of presence rather than proof. The combination of partial auditory sightings and unconfirmed tracks lent the disappearance a spectral quality, as though the aircraft had dissolved into the forest itself. Investigators considered mechanical failure, sudden weather shifts, and navigational errors. Yet, none could definitively explain the aircraft's disappearance without leaving traces behind. Post-flight analysis confirmed that the plane had no known pre-existing malfunctions, and maintenance records indicated all instruments were functioning within standard parameters. Weather reports corroborated the presence of fog, snow, and strong gusts, which could challenge even an experienced pilot. Yet, these factors alone did not account for the complete absence of wreckage or debris. Navigational charts showed no obstacles, yet there are no uncharted variations in topography, including sudden dips, ridges, and frozen waterways, introduced the possibility of an unseen hazard. Each hypothesis offered partial insight, but failed to provide a conclusive narrative, leaving the incident unresolved. Over the following days, the forest reclaimed the paths once crossed by searchers, leaving only scattered snow impressions and the faint echoes of efforts that had failed to locate the plane. Helicopter flight paths were marked on maps, GPS tracks recorded, and temporary camps erected. Yet, the wilderness rapidly erased these traces. Fresh snowfall, drifting wind, and the shadowed canopy obscured any minor evidence left behind, reinforcing the difficulty of finding a small aircraft amid miles of dense forest. Ground teams noted how easily the landscape could mask even significant disturbances, a reminder that time and nature work in concert to conceal events in the boreal wilderness. Participants in the search remembered a silence that enveloped the wilderness, broken here and there by ravens or distant streams, deepening the sense of isolation. The cold, muted environment heightened awareness, and every sound or movement was scrutinized as a potential clue. Observers described the sensation of standing in a space, both immense and intimate, where human presence felt simultaneously dominant and inconsequential. The absence of definitive evidence, combined with the sheer scale of the inner cove, created a lingering tension, as though the forest itself held the answer just out of reach. The pilot's flight, examined decades later, continues to be analyzed and speculated upon, underscoring the vastness of the inner cove and the ease with which people can disappear into it. Aviation historians and wilderness researchers reference the incident as a case study in the challenges of flight in remote areas, emphasizing the interplay of environmental unpredictability, navigational precision, and human endurance. While records preserve times, coordinates, and procedural details, the final moments of the aircraft and its pilot remain unknown, leaving room for continued investigation and reflection. The forest, unchanged yet ever-shifting, stands as a silent witness to the disappearance, a reminder of both the majesty and the peril inherent in Alaska's boreal expanse. Maps may show the flight path, but the pilot's ultimate fate hovers unanswered over the seemingly endless canopy below, the abandoned sled tracks of the Chandela Range. The first traces appeared as a subtle indentation in freshly fallen snow, a series of sled tracks winding across the slope before disappearing into the dense spruce forest of the Chandela Range. Survey teams and trappers alike were struck by the precision of the marks, the way the runners cut shallow grooves that suggested careful handling over uneven terrain. The snow surrounding the tracks was largely undisturbed, save for the wind-sculpted drifts that formed along the tree line, giving the impression that whoever had passed through had done so swiftly and with purpose. Though the tracks followed a plausible route along the natural contours of the slope, there was no indication of who had made them or what the journey had entailed. In a wilderness as expansive and remote as the Chandela Range, even small traces can carry profound significance. And these tracks immediately set off questions that would remain unanswered for years. Each runner mark was crisp and uniform, suggesting deliberate, steady movement. Yet, the absence of accompanying footprints immediately raised questions about who had traveled there and how. Sled operators typically leave impressions from boots, or at least evidence of stops to adjust lines, manage cargo, or rest. Yet here, no such signs existed. The trail appeared as if the sled had floated over the snow, a continuous record of movement, unmarred by human contact. Observers noted the consistent spacing between the runners, indicating careful navigation over the undulating landscape. Whether this was the work of an experienced traveler or the result of unusual conditions that preserved the tracks without footprints remained uncertain, adding an unsettling layer to the enigma. Surveying the surrounding area revealed no signs of a campsite, no discarded equipment, and no obvious breaks in the forest that might indicate a temporary stop, deepening the mystery of the abandoned sled. Normally, travelers navigating such terrain would establish brief halts at clearings or river crossings, leaving some trace behind, fire scars, tool marks, or impressions of canvas. Yet in this instance, the forest seemed undisturbed, aside from the sled tracks themselves, a corridor of movement without evidence of habitation or human presence. Even seasoned trappers acknowledged that the path defied expectation, as if the sled had passed through a zone immune to the ordinary rules of human activity. Wind had sculpted the snow into gentle ridges, and occasional drifting partially obscured sections of the track. Yet the main path remained unusually well preserved, given the region's fluctuating temperatures. The boreal forest of the Chandela Range is subject to rapid shifts, with daytime thawing followed by freezing nights that typically distort or erase shallow impressions. That these sled marks retain their form suggested a recent passage, yet no witness could confirm seeing the sled or its operator. The clarity of the tracks contrasted sharply with the unpredictable nature of the wilderness, raising the possibility that either the passage had occurred under extraordinary conditions or that the evidence itself was an anomaly of timing and environment. Nearby, animal tracks crossed the sled marks sporadically from foxes to hares, but there was no evidence that wildlife had followed or altered the course, leaving the trail story incomplete and puzzling. The presence of these intersecting prints provided minor clues about the timeline. Some impressions were lightly dusted with fresh snow, indicating that the sled tracks predated recent weather events. Yet, the animals appeared indifferent, following their own paths without interacting with the sled, reinforcing the sense that whatever passage had occurred had left a discrete and isolated record. Even the smallest tracks can inform a broader understanding of events in the wilderness. Yet here they only deepen the uncertainty surrounding the journey. As they retrace portions of the sled's route, trappers and surveyors observed the track vanish unexpectedly at a narrow ravine, offering no hint of the traveler's direction. The abrupt end challenged assumptions about conventional travel. As the terrain beyond the point of disappearance was difficult but navigable, observers documented the site meticulously, photographing angles, measuring the depth and width of the runners, and noting the alignment with surrounding topographical features. Despite these efforts, the trail offered no clue about whether the sled had been abandoned, retrieved by an unseen party, or diverted along a path invisible beneath snow or dense undergrowth. The sudden termination of the track amplified the sense of mystery and left the observers with an unanswerable question: what had become of the traveler and the sled? Speculation ranged from sudden snow collapses to hidden ice patches or navigational error. Yet none of these explanations fully accounted for the complete disappearance of the sled or its operator. Environmental factors could explain some of the distortion, but they could not account for the unbroken pattern leading up to the ravine. Observers considered mechanical or structural failure of the sled, but no remnants were found in the vicinity. Theories involving human intervention, whether intentional or accidental, were equally unconfirmed, leaving the sled's disappearance an enduring riddle. Each proposed scenario illuminated certain aspects of the tracks while leaving critical questions unresolved, a hallmark of the most perplexing wilderness mysteries. Examiners of the tracks described an unsettling feeling of being watched by the forest, a quiet stillness interrupted only by the crunch of their boots as they followed a path that led nowhere. The boreal canopy muted sound and filtered light, producing shifting shadows that accentuated the site's isolation. Observers spoke of a tension that seemed to hang in the air, an almost tangible reminder of the forest's vastness and indifference to human presence. In such conditions, even a straightforward investigation acquires a sense of suspense, where every observation is both revealing and frustratingly incomplete. Over time, the snow melted and erasing subtle clues, yet photographs and field notes preserved the brief evidence of a journey that seemed to exist only in memory and documentation. Follow-up surveys confirmed that the area showed no new traces or disturbances, suggesting that whatever occurred had left its mark only briefly and subtly. The sled tracks, once clear and intriguing, became a point of speculation and study, referenced in subsequent explorations and reports of the Chandela Range. Their fleeting visibility reinforced the impermanence of evidence in the wilderness and the enduring nature of questions that cannot be answered through observation alone. The sled tracks remain a silent testament to a passage through the Chandela Range that ended without explanation, leaving the forest itself as the sole witness. The murmuring trees of the Kanishna woods. A low, almost human-like murmur drifted through the snow-laden branches, catching the attention of a trapper who had walked the Kanishna woods for decades without ever hearing anything like it. He paused mid-step, listening as the sound rose and fell, at times almost resembling whispered words, at others fading into the rhythm of the forest itself. The dense stands of spruce and birch seemed to bend toward him, the tree's icy limbs swaying subtly, producing patterns of sound that defied easy explanation. Even after years of traversing the boreal wilderness, he felt a shiver of uncertainty, a momentary dislocation between perception and reality, as though the forest had chosen to speak in a language he could not decipher. It did not resemble wind or animal calls, but a continuous fluctuating tone that shifted in pitch and volume, appearing to come from the trees themselves rather than from the ground or the underbrush. Observers described it as neither wholly musical nor wholly mechanical, a liminal sound that occupied the space between natural phenomena and something more enigmatic. The murmur followed no predictable path, sometimes emanating from one cluster of trees and then seemingly traveling across open glades, yet vanishing when approached closely. Those who attempted to trace its source often found only the ordinary forest, snow-covered trunks, branches glinting with ice, and the soft crunch of their own boots disturbing the silence. The boreal canopy, thick with branches coated in ice and snow, created an intricate network of reflective surfaces, amplifying ordinary noises into strange, echoing whispers that defied easy explanation. Temperature inversions during winter nights often cause subtle changes in air density, carrying sounds further than expected, while frozen branches occasionally release sharp pops or groans as ice shifts under stress. Within this complex acoustic environment, the murmuring assumed a quality that was at once spatially diffuse and intimately close, giving the impression that the forest itself was alive with an unseen presence. Even seasoned trappers acknowledged the uncanny character of the sounds, noting that their direction and cadence rarely aligned with any identifiable source. Historical accounts from hunters and local surveyors consistently mention nights when the trees seemed to speak, often coinciding with gusts funneling through narrow clearings or along frozen waterways. Journals preserved by early prospectors and park officials describe similar observations, with repeated emphasis on the disorienting nature of the murmur and its ability to unsettle even the most experienced observers. In some instances, the sound was reported as harmonizing with natural elements, branches creaking, ice breaking, yet rising above them in timbre and continuity. While no written record suggested any threat, the phenomenon was treated with caution and reverence, acknowledged as a recurring oddity that demanded attention and patience. Acoustic experts later speculated that the murmuring could result from wind resonating through interlocking branches, ice cracking on frozen bark, or subtle reverberations across the uneven forest floor. Yet none of these fully accounted for its irregular patterns. Laboratory simulations of boreal forests and wind patterns produced partial similarities but lacked the same organic unpredictability. Recordings taken on site captured fragments of sound, but the full experience proved difficult to reproduce, suggesting that either subtle environmental variables or human perception itself contributed to the phenomenon. Scientific curiosity piqued, yet the auditory enigma resisted complete analysis, leaving it firmly in the realm of the unexplained. Witnesses reported an uncanny effect on perception. Isolated in the silent forest, each murmur felt intentional, as though the trees themselves were observing, coaxing, or warning, and even experienced outdoorsmen admitted unease. Snow-laden branches reflected light in uneven patterns, creating shadowed corridors that enhanced the impression of movement or presence beyond the purely auditory. For those who lingered, the murmur seemed to interact with their own heartbeat, breathing, and footsteps, producing a sense of subtle orchestration. No fear was reported, but an undeniable tension persisted. A reminder that the Kanisha woods were vast, unpredictable, and capable of producing experiences that challenged human comprehension. Researchers who ventured into the area documented the phenomenon at specific times of day, noting temperature inversions, snow density, and prevailing wind directions, but no equipment could capture the full range of the auditory effect. Microphones and accelerometers registered fragments, yet they failed to convey the immersive quality described by human observers. Field notes emphasized patterns that were perceptible only when standing within the forest itself, suggesting that spatial orientation, distance, and environmental acoustics played a significant role. Each expedition returned with additional data, reinforcing the reality of the murmuring while deepening its mystery. Present at the scene, they noted a persistent sense of the forest's quiet consciousness, a tension that rendered natural sounds and strange murmurs almost indistinguishable. Even after leaving the woods, the memory of the sound persisted, replaying in the mind with a clarity that contradicted ordinary recollection. Attempts to rationalize the experience, blaming wind, animal activity, or ice, never satisfied, as the auditory phenomenon seemed to defy any singular cause. The Conditioner woods in their remote expanses fostered a unique environment in which perception and reality intertwined, leaving visitors with questions they could not fully answer. Despite careful observation and repeated study, the murmuring persisted as a phenomenon resistant to explanation, rooted in environmental factors, yet imbued with an unshakable sense of mystery that left even seasoned forest travelers unsettled. Each account, whether from trappers, surveyors, or researchers, affirmed the authenticity of the experience. Yet no consensus emerged on its origin. Some spoke of it as a natural quirk amplified by the boreal environment, while others described an almost sentient quality, as if the trees themselves were holding knowledge beyond human reach. The sound, subtle yet insistent, remained as elusive as the vast forest through which it threaded. The Kanisha woods continue to echo with murmurs that vanish when approached, leaving the trees themselves as silent witnesses to a sound no one can fully name. The Tok Highway Shadow Encounter. Headlights cutting through the pre-dawn fog revealed a dark figure slipping along the edge of the Tok Highway, vanishing as quickly as it appeared and leaving a driver questioning what they had just seen. The encounter lasted only seconds, yet it left a lingering unease that would not fade even after reaching the warmth of the nearest rest stop. The stretch of road was familiar, traveled countless times by locals and long-haul drivers alike. Yet in that fleeting moment, it seemed transformed, as though the shadow had imposed a different reality onto the pavement and the forest beyond. Witnesses often describe a tension between the ordinary and the inexplicable, a sudden shift that forces one to question perception against memory and expectation. The shadow, witnesses say, had a human form but stretched unnaturally, gliding with a motion that neither pedestrian nor animal could account for, puzzling observers along the snow-lined road. Some have said the figure seemed to glide effortlessly along the asphalt, neither slowed nor disturbed by snowbanks or ditches. Others noted that it appeared to hesitate, almost as though aware of oncoming headlights, retreating into darkness whenever approached directly. The visual impression was sharp enough to leave a lasting mental image, but fleeting enough that repeated observation yielded nothing concrete, creating a tension between certainty and doubt that has fueled both local lore and curiosity from outsiders. The highway winds through dense stands of spruce and poplar with steep embankments and uneven terrain that cast deep shadows and can distort both light and perception, complicating any attempt to identify moving shapes. Moonlight or the glare of headlights can interact with tree trunks, branches, and ice-coated boughs to produce elongated silhouettes or sudden contrast that mislead the eye. In winter months, drifting snow or residual frost on roadside signs can further distort shapes. Yet none of these environmental factors fully explains why multiple witnesses report similar proportions, movement, and timing of the shadow. Even experienced drivers familiar with the quirks of the road acknowledge the phenomenon as different from ordinary optical illusions. Multiple travelers over the years have reported similar encounters at nearly the same stretch of road, often under low-light conditions, hinting at a pattern that has yet to be formally documented or explained. Accounts collected by local news outlets, roadside assistance reports, and anecdotal compilations consistently reference the stretch between TOC and nearby forested bends, where visibility is partially obscured by trees and slight curves in the asphalt. Some drivers report seeing the figure in the same general area over consecutive nights, suggesting either an environmental factor consistently producing the illusion or, more unsettlingly, a recurring presence. Each report adds to the puzzle, reinforcing the idea that there is more than a single misperception at play. Scientists and skeptics alike have suggested explanations ranging from optical illusions caused by distant headlights to the effects of driver fatigue. Yet none fully account for the fleeting, sharply defined shape observed on numerous occasions. Headlight beams bouncing off uneven snow, reflections from guardrails, or even deer crossing the road have been proposed as potential sources. But these do not consistently match witness descriptions of size, posture, or movement. In addition, the timing of many encounters during early morning or late evening hours, when alertness is typically high, complicates arguments rooted solely in fatigue. The phenomenon exists at the intersection of physical reality and human perception, resisting conclusive categorization. Some drivers stopped to investigate only to find empty snow banks and forested edges, while others reported a sudden cold wind or the eerie feeling of being watched, heightening the unsettling nature of the experience. Attempts to approach the shadow are met with a disorienting sensation, as though the figure disappears into the forest itself or slips into a thin veil of darkness along the roadside. The reaction is visceral. Some drivers report an involuntary quickening of breath or a tightening of muscles, a subtle fight-or-flight response triggered not by danger but by the uncanny. This combination of visual ambiguity and physiological response strengthens the impression that something beyond ordinary perception has been observed. Local law enforcement and road maintenance crews acknowledge the reports, but have found no footprints, tire marks, or other physical evidence, leaving the phenomenon unverified, yet persistently reported. Officers stationed at nearby checkpoints note occasional calls from drivers who swear they saw something unusual. Yet, investigations consistently return inconclusive. Snow and ice conditions make it difficult to preserve any evidence, even if present, and the fleeting nature of the shadow leaves little trace to record. The mystery persists in public consciousness because the encounters are real to those who experience them. Even if empirical verification remains elusive, the shadow lingers in memory long after the encounter, shaping stories and retellings with each witness struggling to reconcile the familiar safety of the highway with the inexplicable presence they briefly observed. Travelers describe lingering hesitation as they pass the area on subsequent trips, scanning roadside edges for movement, unsure whether they are anticipating the shadow or genuinely at risk of seeing it again. Conversation in local diners, lodges, and online forums often circles back to this same highway segment. The anecdotal consistency reinforces its status as a location where the normal rules of perception seem to falter. The phenomenon has become part of the fabric of the highway, a subtle presence that merges with memory and expectation. Though environmental conditions have been carefully monitored and reports repeatedly filed, the shadow persists as an elusive presence bound to the talk highway, yet beyond comprehension, unnerving those who travel it. Each new report adds to the narrative but resolves nothing, sustaining a cycle of intrigue, caution, and lingering uncertainty. Experts and skeptics alike can hypothesize endlessly about environmental or psychological factors, but the convergence of location, description, and repeated observation resists any tidy conclusion. The shadow exists both in the forest and in the mind, occupying a space that challenges conventional understanding. The highway continues to play host to shadows that vanish when approached. A reminder that even familiar routes can conceal secrets the eye alone cannot confirm. A fire that burned cold in the Mento Flats. Hunters moving through the flat, mist-shrouded wetlands of the Mento Flats reported a fire that seemed impossible. Its orange and blue flames dancing over brush and peat, without the warmth that should have accompanied them. The initial sighting was unsettling enough to prompt the men to pause, gazing across the low, reflective water and the moss-covered hummocks, uncertain whether their senses were deceiving them. The flames exhibited all the visual characteristics of a normal fire, flickering tongues of light, small sparks, and the occasional curl of smoke. But each observer was struck by the absence of heat, a sensation as incongruous as seeing water flowing uphill. Even from several yards away, they noted the unnatural chill and the paradoxical contrast between appearance and experience. A riddle of combustion that defied explanation. The flames twisted and flickered with the familiar visual cues of combustion. Yet thermometers placed nearby registered barely a fraction of expected heat, leaving observers questioning both measurement and perception. Attempts to collect small samples of peat or fallen branches yielded no scorched material. The flames licked at the vegetation, but left it unburned in any conventional sense. Light from the fire reflected off the wetland water in a surreal manner, intensifying the visual impression of fire while heightening the awareness that this was no ordinary blaze. Observers reported that shadows cast by the flames did not behave in the ways they anticipated, further emphasizing the eerie disconnect between sight and physical experience. Surrounding the anomalous blaze, boggy terrain, and clusters of black spruce created a landscape that absorbed and reflected light in unusual ways, with humidity and early morning fog adding layers of distortion to what the eye perceived. Pools of standing water mirrored the fire's glow, producing a doubled, almost hypnotic effect, while the low vegetation seemed untouched despite the fire's presence. The flatness of the Mento Flats amplified the sensation of isolation. The landscape extended in every direction without obstruction, making the cold fire appear suspended in space rather than rooted in the peat beneath. This combination of environmental factors made it difficult to separate natural optical effects from something genuinely extraordinary. Over the course of several weeks, multiple witnesses described the same phenomenon in strikingly similar terms. Fire that burned, flickered, and moved, yet failed to produce the heat, smoke, or scent normally expected from combustion. Trappers and hunters traveling separate routes reported glimpsing similar flames under comparable conditions, suggesting a pattern that resisted casual explanation. Reports frequently noted the fire's responsiveness to environmental changes. Gusts of wind would bend the flames, yet warmth remained absent, and the fire did not spread as conventional combustion would dictate. The consistency of these accounts added to the growing sense that the phenomenon was real and repeatable, if entirely inexplicable. Proposed explanations from fleeting methane ignitions to chemical reactions in saturated peat fail to fully account for the persistent cold experienced by those standing near the flames. According to scientists and local experts, methane or other flammable gases can produce visible flames over wetland surfaces, but they are invariably hot to the touch and usually accompanied by pungent odor, both of which were missing in the Mento Flat sightings. Optical illusions created by fog, water reflections, or ambient light can simulate the appearance of flames. Yet the observers reported seeing distinct tongues of fire moving independently and interacting with the terrain in a seemingly deliberate manner. Each hypothesis offers partial insight, but falls short of explaining the anomaly completely. Some onlookers reached toward the fire, touching it with sticks or gloved hands, and were met with cold where warmth should have been, heightening their confusion and awe. One hunter described stepping into the waterlogged ground near the fire, expecting heat to rise from the surface, and being met instead with a chill that seemed to seep into boots and clothing. Others reported a tingling sensation in the skin, a dissonance between expectation and perception, which left them uncertain whether to retreat or investigate further. Each interaction reinforced the notion that the fire violated conventional understanding of combustion, creating a palpable tension between observation and natural law. Efforts to document the phenomenon included photographs, temperature readings, and reports to regional forest authorities. Yet, every measurement underscored the anomaly rather than resolving it, leaving official records sparse but intriguing. Images captured in daylight and low light revealed flames, but they did not convey the absence of heat, leaving evidence that was simultaneously compelling and incomplete. Temperature probes confirmed near ambient readings even within the heart of the fire, and smoke detectors registered no particulate increase despite visual confirmation of combustion. These attempts to reconcile observation with measurable data highlighted the enduring challenge of capturing an event that was both physically present and paradoxically intangible. The fire has taken on a quiet presence in local lore, woven into the oral history of trappers, hunters, and native guides who recount not only the sight, but the impossible chill and the uncanny awareness of being near something beyond ordinary explanation. Stories circulate of nights spent near the edges of the phenomenon, with the fire's glow reflecting in distant water or frost, and the eerie perception that it was aware of observers. Folkloric interpretations suggest spirits, elemental forces, or natural mysteries beyond human comprehension. Yet even pragmatic accounts acknowledge the dissonance between sight and sensation. These narratives, passed along quietly and sometimes hesitantly, underscore the lingering human fascination with a natural law apparently defied. Even after repeated observation and careful recording, the cold fire persists as a paradox of nature in the Mento Flats, an elemental enigma that defies both expectation and scientific scrutiny. Each sighting confirms that something unusual is taking place, yet it remains just beyond the reach of conventional understanding. The phenomenon challenges assumptions about combustion, heat, and perception in ways that are simultaneously tangible and unexplainable. Locals continue to travel through the wetlands with a cautious awareness of where the fire may appear. Yet every encounter reinforces the impossibility and the mystery. Flames that consume without heat continue to flicker in the marshes, a reminder that even familiar forests can conceal phenomena that challenge the most basic laws of the natural world. The disappearing footprints of Denali's northern foothills. Footprints in the northern foothills of Denali appeared with startling clarity, only to dissolve moments later, leaving the snow smooth and unbroken as though no passage had occurred. Trails emerged in precise lines, curves, and occasional abrupt halts. Yet, the moments required to record or follow them always seemed to exceed their fleeting existence. Those who traversed these slopes could find themselves staring at an expanse of snow that seemed untouched, the evidence of travel swallowed by some imperceptible force. Even familiar paths worn and tested by seasons of hikers and guides could display new tracks that vanished within the span of minutes. Each instance seemed to defy expectation, challenging any attempt to connect movement with consequence in a landscape so rigidly governed by natural law. The impressions retained intricate details of tread and sole. Yet the snow beneath showed no signs of compression, moisture displacement, or disturbance that might explain their disappearance. Sometimes the footprints seemed pressed deeply enough to suggest weight and momentum. Yet the surrounding snow remained unchanged, without ridges, displacement, or melting to mark the passage. Stray fragments of ice or faint depressions could occasionally be detected, but even these traces faded quickly, leaving a uniform surface that mocked scrutiny. Those studying the prints noted that they did not scatter or fragment. They simply ceased to exist in a manner that was sudden and complete, as though the snow itself refused to record the intrusion. Windless stretches and undisturbed slopes framed the vanishing tracks, amplifying the sense that the snow itself had selectively reclaimed the evidence of movement. Slopes often lay bathed in sunlight or shaded by cliffs and ridges. Yet, the disappearance occurred in both conditions. The surrounding terrain betrayed no signs of typical erosion, and air currents were insufficient to explain the rapid loss of footprints. It was as though the patterns were drawn onto the snow with invisible ink, discernible only for a brief moment before fading entirely. In these instances, the snowfields felt less like a passive landscape and more like an active participant, capable of erasing the passage of those who crossed it. Curved lines, abrupt halts, and evenly spaced strides hinted at intent or pattern. Yet each trail dissolved, as if guided by some unseen force. Trails often traced the contours of small rises and hollows, navigating around rocks and patches of exposed ice, suggesting an awareness of the terrain. Occasionally, two or more tracks would converge or parallel one another for short distances before one or both vanished, leaving only the other to continue. Even patterns that seemed deliberate could not withstand scrutiny, disappearing entirely without warning. The combination of precision and disappearance created a rhythm that was both mesmerizing and unnerving, hinting at an intelligence or mechanism hidden within the environment itself. Echoes of previous paths lingered briefly, faint impressions that faded faster than any known natural process could account for, leaving only questions in their wake. In some cases, tracks appeared in areas heavily traversed by local guides and mountaineers. Yet no one could account for the origin or timing of the prints. Others noted that prints sometimes formed in clusters, then thinned out, leaving no discernible trail. The ephemeral nature of these impressions made them resistant to memory, documentation, or analysis, as if each encounter were designed to be a fleeting glimpse of something beyond understanding. Even when footprints aligned with expected travel routes, their disappearance rendered navigation meaningless, leaving a void where certainty should have been. Photographs and casts captured fleeting shapes, but each image seemed haunted by absence, with outlines blurring and melting before their significance could be fully registered. Attempts to create physical molds of the tracks often failed, with snow shifting subtly between moments of observation, erasing edges and detail. Photographs could show an outline that barely suggested a footprint, but by the time film was developed or digital images examined, the shapes had often lost clarity. The transitory quality of the tracks made them unreliable as evidence, frustrating efforts to document the phenomenon scientifically or narratively. Each failed attempt reinforced the sense that the foothills themselves were actively withholding information, preserving the mystery. Muffled sounds of crunching snow sometimes accompanied the tracks. Yet the prints vanished without a trace, creating a dissonance between action and evidence. Occasionally, hikers would hear the faint compression of snow underfoot. Yet when they turned to inspect the trail, the prints would already be gone. At other times, tracks appeared across fresh snow that had not been disturbed by any known activity, with no sound preceding their formation. This disconnection between perception and reality contributed to a growing sense of unease, as the landscape refused to behave according to familiar rules. Each auditory or visual cue promised discovery only to be denied, deepening the enigmatic nature of the phenomenon. Repeated formations hinted at regularity. Certain slopes, hollows, and edges of the snowfields bore vanishing trails with uncanny consistency, suggesting rules that were never revealed. Tracks are often aligned with depressions in the terrain, the ridges of small rises, or the edges of snow-packed corridors. Multiple sightings over the years showed recurring patterns hinting at predictability. Yet no observer could replicate the conditions or anticipate the disappearance. This paradox of regularity without explanation fueled speculation and unease, leaving even the most experienced traversers questioning the stability of the terrain. The footprints seemed to obey invisible parameters, offering glimpses of order only to vanish before understanding could take root. Even the most traversed corridors of Denali's northern foothills held footprints that disappeared without warning, challenging expectations of cause and effect across miles of frozen terrain. Tracks seemed indifferent to human presence, vanishing regardless of attention or intervention. Paths that had been previously observed could reappear days later in identical patterns, only to fade once again. The impermanence of the impressions created a haunting atmosphere in a landscape already known for its extremes, amplifying the tension between human curiosity and natural unpredictability. Each encounter left a residual feeling of displacement, as if the foothills themselves had reshaped reality momentarily before retreating into silence. Tracks that emerge and then vanish continue to haunt the snow, leaving the foothills to guard their secrets with a silence that is as complete as it is enigmatic. The circle of melted snow near Rampart. A perfect circle of bare ground appeared amid the snow near Rampart. Its edges are sharply defined and eerily symmetrical against the surrounding white expanse. At first glance, the clearing seemed almost deliberate, as though someone had carefully outlined it by hand. Yet no tracks, tools, or disturbances marked the surrounding snow. The contrast between the circle and the untouched forest floor drew attention immediately, the bright white of the snow amplifying the unnatural precision of the shape. Those who stumbled across it reported a subtle tension, the kind that arises when something familiar bends against expectation. The clearing did not conform to any natural slope, ridge, or sun exposure pattern, as though it existed in a space apart from the ordinary forest rhythms. The diameter of the circle spanned several meters, its smooth surface contrasting sharply with the jagged textures of the untouched snow beyond. The snow around it appeared dense and uniform, while the circle itself remained bare, the ground underneath slightly softer yet devoid of footprints or drag marks. Subtle variations in frost hinted at warmth that had never been recorded. A faint glow of thaw that ended abruptly at the circle's edge. Shadows cast across the clearing accentuated the geometric perfection, making the shape appear even more deliberate and isolated from its surroundings. Each angle and curve seemed measured, as if obeying rules invisible to any observer. Additional circles emerged nearby, some solitary, others in loose clusters, suggesting a hidden rhythm that defied immediate explanation. In several instances, they formed in straight lines or gentle arcs, as though following invisible guides across the boreal expanse. The repeated emergence of these shapes in proximity gave an impression of design rather than chance. Yet no pattern linked them to human activity, wildlife paths, or water flow. The clusters sometimes contained circles of varying sizes, their diameters and spacing irregular enough to frustrate attempts to predict their placement. Yet even amid irregularity, the sense of intent lingered, compelling the mind to search for meaning where none could be easily discerned. Between one day and the next, new patches appeared or expanded, as if the forest itself had rearranged its winter mantle without human interference. Reports noted circles that had grown noticeably overnight, edges smoothing further, while nearby areas of snow remained untouched. The speed of these changes contrasted sharply with the static stillness of the surrounding forest, creating a tension between motion and permanence. Observers found themselves drawn to return repeatedly, hoping to capture or understand the transient phenomenon, only to discover that each new visit brought slight but significant alterations, as if the forest were rewriting the landscape in secret. Edges of the circles bore faint discolorations, frost that seemed thinner than surrounding areas, yet no signs of fire, animal tracks, or melting from sunlight were evident. The ground appeared subtly darker, almost damp, though no moisture could be felt when touched. Small depressions hinted at previous pressure, yet no pattern of compaction consistent with weight, footprints, or equipment existed. Snow crystals along the circle's boundary often glittered differently, catching light in a way that accentuated the unnatural outline. Even the air seemed to respond, carrying a chill that contrasted with otherwise calm conditions, giving the area an almost imperceptible aura of anomaly. Paths leading close to the circles showed no disturbance. Yet those who passed nearby reported an instinctive unease, a sensation that something unusual had claimed the ground. The phenomenon resisted explanation, leaving witnesses uncertain whether the effect was visual, psychological, or physical in nature. Snow that would normally yield under a foot remained perfect in adjacent areas, creating a subtle tension between expectation and reality. Even after days of repeated observation, the circles retained their unclaimed authority over the space, refusing to integrate with the natural order of the forest. The anomaly became an enigma, a spatial puzzle whose logic existed only on its own terms. Season after season, the circles appeared in similar areas, but never perfectly replicated, hinting at a hidden order guiding their formation. Some formations appeared in early winter, others deep into throwing months. Yet, the shapes maintained their clarity regardless of temperature fluctuations or snowfall. Even when snow levels rose to obscure previous circles, new patches appeared with remarkable similarity in alignment or spacing. The recurrent suggested rules at play, though no observer could determine them, leaving the shapes to function as both markers and mysteries, guiding attention without offering answers. No natural process could account for the symmetry, scale, and speed of formation, leaving the forest quietly defiant of explanation. There were no signs of fire, geothermal heat, or chemical influence. Wildlife activity could not account for the size or precision, and sunlight alone was insufficient to produce such uniform throwing. Yet the circles persisted, appearing repeatedly and with unwavering geometry. Each instance defied expectation, leaving investigators, locals, and visitors alike to confront the possibility that these formations belong to a phenomenon entirely outside conventional understanding. The Boreal Forest maintained its silence, indifferent to human curiosity, yet undeniably expressive in its creation. Each appearance left a silent imprint on memory as well as snow, a reminder that some aspects of the boreal wilderness resist human understanding. Visitors often returned weeks later only to find the circles altered, vanished, or replaced by new patterns. Their fleeting existence becomes part of the narrative of the land. Attempts to map or document the shapes yielded inconsistent results. Photographs captured them, yet the effect of perspective, light, and time made each image slightly different. The mystery remained intact, reinforcing the sense that the circles operated under rules inaccessible to ordinary observation. In this way, the rampart clearing became more than a physical anomaly. It became a symbol of the forest's capacity to withhold and guard its secrets. The circles endure, unclaimed and inexplicable, as if the forest itself keeps secrets only it can witness. The silent boom over the Inno Basin. A deep resonant boom rolled across the Inno Basin, so sudden and untraceable that the forest seemed to shiver in place. The sound had no visible origin, emerging from the quiet expanse of spruce, tamarack, and swamp with a weight that suggested enormous energy, yet left nothing disturbed on the surface. Waves of vibration traveled through the frozen ground, stirring the stagnant air and rustling the low-hanging branches as if the forest itself had absorbed the event and reflected it in whispers. Observers noted that the sound carried unnaturally far, echoing across rivers and lakes without diminishing, filling the canopy with an impossible intensity that drew attention despite its mystery. There was no trail to follow, no mark of machinery or human interference, only the lingering impression of a force that existed beyond comprehension. The vibrations traveled through frozen soil and murky water, leaving a faint tremor that lingered long after the initial resonance had faded. Snow-covered marshes pulsed subtly, and ice over shallow streams shivered as if the boom had brushed against the surface. Even patches of moss and fallen leaves seemed momentarily unsettled, tilting in ways too small to measure, but enough to register as anomalous. It was a sensation both physical and intangible, a silent signature of energy imprinted on the landscape without any source to account for it. The basin's quiet returned gradually, but the memory of the movement persisted, leaving a trace of disturbance that no explanation could fully reconcile. Intervals between the booms were unpredictable, sometimes clustered in rapid succession, other times separated by hours of stillness that heightened anticipation. The irregular timing suggested no mechanical or natural rhythm, no pattern that could be mapped or predicted. On certain days, multiple booms would roll across the basin in overlapping waves, while on others, weeks could pass without a single recurrence. This unpredictability fostered a tension that seemed almost deliberate, an unspoken communication between the landscape and whatever unknown force generated the sound. Each sudden reverberation reminded those within earshot of the forest's capacity to conceal phenomena beyond ordinary comprehension. The echoes stretched across miles of spruce and tamarack, folding into the landscape in ways that made their origin impossible to pinpoint. Hills and ridges seemed to bend and redirect the sound, channels of air and space conducting it in strange, inconsistent directions. Even large water bodies did not dissipate the resonance. Instead, the waves traveled along the surface and through ice, reaching distant points with minimal loss of energy. The result was a disorienting effect, one that made it impossible to locate the source or understand its scale, as though the basin itself had become an instrument, channeling an unseen force through its expanse. Frozen ponds and slow-moving streams reflected subtle ripples, as if the water itself had absorbed the mystery and released it quietly back into the air. In some areas, ice cracked faintly under the strain, producing tiny secondary sounds that seemed almost alive, echoing the primary boom with an uncertain voice. Snow near riverbanks and swamp edges occasionally shifted in delicate patterns, resembling concentric rings or fleeting depressions that vanished within hours. There was no explanation. Grounded in wind, temperature, or wildlife activity, the effect remained enigmatic, a manifestation of sound that seemed to interact with the forest in ways no observer could quantify. Seasons passed with the phenomenon recurring, from the long winter nights to the throbbing months, its persistence baffling all attempts at explanation. The booms had been reported across multiple years, documented in various locations within the basin, yet always following no discernible schedule. Even during extreme cold, when snow and ice would normally muffle sound, the resonance cut through the forest with startling clarity. In warmer months, as the ice melted and waterways expanded, the sound retained its strange power, bridging frozen and thawed terrain with equal ease. The persistence suggested a source independent of seasonal change, a force indifferent to ordinary temporal or environmental limitations. A strange awareness settled over those nearby, a sensation that the forest itself had acknowledged the sound and responded with silent tension. Trees seemed to lean subtly toward or away from certain points, swaying in a rhythm that did not match the wind. Birds paused mid-flight or emitted sudden flares of warning calls, vanishing without apparent cause. The forest carried the echoes in a way that altered perception, as if the Income Basin were aware of its own anomaly, holding the reverberations in a quiet, deliberate embrace. It was a strange, almost sentient quality, imbuing the land with an aura of silent intelligence. Nothing, no earthquake, aircraft, or explosion could explain the deep resonance, leaving only the forest and its shadows as silent witnesses. Instruments measured no seismic activity corresponding to the sound. Aviation logs reported no low-flying crafts, and no industrial presence was recorded nearby. Even local wildlife could not be implicated, as the scale and energy of the boom far exceeded anything natural to the region. The result was a persistent enigma, one that challenged conventional understanding of sound, space, and the way energy interacts with the boreal environment. The forest retained the mystery, unyielding and impenetrable, leaving explanation perpetually out of reach. Even after the booms ceased, the memory of their weight and reach lingered, imprinting the inner basin with an unspoken unease. Tracks of snow and ice often appeared untouched. Yet, those who had heard the resonance recalled the sensation as if the ground itself had moved beneath their feet. Attempts to record or predict the phenomenon yielded inconsistent results. Photographs capturing shadows and ripples, but never the source. Each recurrence reinforced the sense that the forest was a living archive of unexplained events, a place where ordinary laws of physics seemed to bend under invisible forces. The forest remains still, yet the echo, the untraceable boom, continues to haunt every quiet hour in the basin. The eddies of warm air near the Kuskokwim Valley forest edge. Small pockets of warm air appeared unexpectedly at the edge of the Kuskokwim Valley forest, carrying a heat that seemed at odds with the surrounding frost and snow. These anomalies emerged quietly without precedent, drifting through the boreal landscape like invisible currents that left traces of change in their wake. The phenomenon had been noted over multiple years, each occurrence brief yet distinct, as though the forest itself had opened channels for some unseen force. Trees remained still, untouched by wind. Yet the air seemed to ripple around them, carrying warmth in subtle waves that settled over the frozen ground before vanishing without residue. The contrast between the warmth and the encompassing cold created an atmosphere both uncanny and compelling, marking the forest edge as a site where ordinary perception faltered. Where these eddies touched the ground, snow and ice melted in irregular patterns, leaving transient patches of damp earth and glistening frost rings that defied conventional explanation. Footprints, frost-coated twigs, and fallen needles occasionally revealed signs of subtle rearrangement, as if the warmth had brushed past and rearranged them, leaving behind an almost imperceptible signature. In places where the air pulled, thin rivulets of melted snow traced irregular paths across the frozen soil, vanishing after a few hours, leaving no lasting evidence of the thermal anomaly. Even frost-covered moss appeared to shimmer momentarily, responding to the unseen heat in ways that suggested movement without a visible source. Their timing was inconsistent, sometimes emerging in the chill of early morning, other times lingering into the late afternoon without warning. There was no rhythm to their appearance, no seasonal pattern that could reliably anticipate their arrival. On certain days, multiple eddies would manifest near each other, merging briefly before separating and dissipating, leaving the impression of choreography invisible to human eyes. On other days, the air remained cold and undisturbed for hours, the forest holding its silence as if acknowledging the phenomenon's absence. Each emergence carried the same startling quality: warmth without cause, an anomaly in an otherwise consistent landscape. Some eddies remained tightly confined to a single hollow or stand of trees, while others expanded across dozens of meters, shifting and twisting as if guided by invisible currents. Their movement was irregular yet purposeful, following contours of the terrain with an uncanny precision that defied explanation. At times, the warm pockets seemed to avoid certain areas entirely, leaving depressions, roots, and undergrowth untouched, while at other times they spread over marshes and streams with equal intensity. The variability in scale and reach added to the mystery, making it impossible to anticipate where the next patch of anomalous warmth would appear or how it would behave. Wildlife responded in subtle ways. Birds altered their flight paths, small mammals paused mid-step, and the air seemed to carry scents of thawed vegetation where no thaw should exist. Tracks of rabbits and foxes near the forest edge occasionally led into warmed areas and then disappeared in directions that suggested hesitation or avoidance. The forest seemed to hum with quiet life, attuned to something imperceptible yet powerful, an effect beyond instinct or necessity. Even the low hum of insects in spring would pause briefly when a warm eddy passed, resuming its rhythm only after the air had cooled. The phenomenon persisted across seasons, from the biting cold of midwinter to the soft warmth of early spring, leaving no clear pattern to mark its recurrence. In the deep freeze of January, tiny pockets of warmth would emerge near frozen marshes, carrying with them subtle distortions in frost and snow. By March, as days lengthened and temperatures rose, the eddies maintained the same inexplicable character, appearing and vanishing in the same silent, fleeting manner. Observations over the years confirmed the persistence of the anomaly. Yet no single account provided insight into its origin, leaving a consistent enigma amid seasonal transitions. Branches swayed gently as though acknowledging the passage of these warm pockets, and streams of mist wove around them without resistance, almost accommodating their presence. Shadows shifted slightly as if caught between cold and warmth, elongating and contracting in ways that suggested depth and movement imperceptible to the naked eye. Water and shallow streams sometimes rippled in isolation, reflecting light differently as the warmth passed overhead. The forest seemed aware of eddy's path, bending subtly around them, as though the land itself could sense and respond to the invisible force shaping the air. Without any geothermal, atmospheric, or mechanical explanation, the heat persisted, observed only by the forest edge. There were no signs of human activity, no evidence of machinery, and no natural explanation consistent with the observed effects. The warmth emerged and vanished without sound, trace, or pattern, defying every conventional understanding of microclimates or weather systems. Even in the stillest of days, when every leaf and needle hung motionless, the eddies would arrive and retreat as if independent of gravity, wind, or thermal gradients. Even after the eddies dissipated, a lingering sense of displacement remained, as if the air itself had been rewritten by their presence. Ground that had felt solid now carried a subtle softness. Patches of moss glimmered differently, and the forest seemed altered in tone and texture. Each instance left an impression not just on the landscape, but on perception, creating an awareness that something unseen had passed. The phenomenon remained an unclaimed force in the Kobuk Valley, a mystery woven into the boreal edge, where warmth and cold collided without explanation. The warmth fades, yet the memory of these unseen currents continues to ripple through the quiet forest, leaving questions that refuse to settle. The abandoned logging machine of the Copper River Basin. Deep within the Copper River Basin, a rusted logging machine stood frozen among the trees, its tracks half buried in moss and soil, as if time had chosen to forget it. The machine, massive and imposing even in decay, hinted at the scale of work once attempted here, though no records explained why it had been left behind. Its skeletal frame protruded from the undergrowth, a silent reminder of human effort, abandoned abruptly in a region where the forest could reclaim all that was left unattended. Local guides passing nearby spoke only in hushed tones, recounting glimpses of its twisted panels and the way it seemed to disappear behind a veil of birch and spruce, as though reluctant to be found. Its presence in such isolation created a quiet unease, an unanswered question lingering among the shadows of the dense canopy. Its massive treads, once capable of crushing underbrush and leveling paths, now bore only the weight of frost and decades of neglect, with panels warped and paint flaking from relentless exposure. Rust had taken hold in every seam, transforming the steel into a patchwork of coppery tones that shimmered faintly in sporadic sunlight. Hydraulic pistons, once responsive and precise, now jutted stiffly at unnatural angles, frozen in mid-motion, their hoses frayed and dangling like the tendrils of some mechanical creature. Even the operator's cabin had succumbed to time. Glass shattered or missing entirely, leaving an empty shell with jagged edges that caught the wind. In this state, the machine seemed less a tool of industry and more an enigmatic sculpture, one whose meaning had eroded alongside the metal itself. Trees grew close, their roots twisting around its frame, and small animals had burrowed in cavities long since hollowed by rust, turning the machine into a strange extension of the forest. Spruce branches pressed against its sides, weaving in and out of exposed engine components, while moss and lichens claimed every horizontal surface. Occasionally, a squirrel darted along the treads, disappearing into the engine bay, and birds nested in the shadowed recesses of the cabin, their calls echoing off steel and wood in an oddly harmonious rhythm. The machine had become, in all visible ways, less a remnant of human activity than a participant in the slow, relentless cycle of life and decay. Even the wind seemed to treat it differently here, whispering through the twisted metal as if acknowledging a presence it could neither define nor comprehend. No records indicated why the machine had been left, nor any accounts of workers encountering difficulties. It was as if the forest itself had claimed it suddenly and without explanation. Logging operations had once reached deep into the basin, exploiting stands of birch and spruce for decades. Yet none of the operational logs, maps, or photographs detailed this particular machine. Questions arose over whether it had broken down during extraction, become stuck in soft soil, or been abandoned intentionally. Yet, none of these theories satisfied the weight of its isolation. In the absence of documentation, speculation filled the spaces where certainty should have existed, leaving a story suspended in silence. Travelers often remarked that its mere presence carried a sense of history withheld, a narrative unspoken yet profoundly felt. Around the machine, the basin stretched into dense stands of spruce and birch, with narrow streams cutting through, reflecting the dull gleam of metal half hidden beneath the canopy. Branches arched over the machine, as if attempting to conceal it from any passing eyes, and fallen logs lay in irregular patterns around its base, adding to the impression that nature had meticulously integrated it into the landscape. In certain lighting, the machine's edges blurred with shadows, and it was nearly impossible to discern where steel ended and forest began. The surroundings, while peaceful, seemed almost complicit in the mystery, creating an atmosphere where stillness was both comforting and unnerving. There was a rhythm to the basin, a quiet pulse of life from which the machine did not deviate, but against which it somehow stood out, uncanny and immovable. Occasionally, unusual impressions in the soil suggested that something had passed near it recently, but no definitive footprints, tracks, or traces revealed the nature of the presence. Depressions in mud and scuffed vegetation hinted at movement without clarity, leading to more questions than answers. Whether animal, human, or something else entirely, these anomalies imbued the area with an invisible tension. Small disturbances that might otherwise have gone unnoticed assumed significance when juxtaposed with the abandoned machine, and every sound, crackling, branches, a distant call, seemed amplified against the backdrop of steel and shadow. The forest, normally predictable in its cycles, appeared to register these intrusions, leaving a sense that the machine was not merely inert, but a sentinel to unseen activity. Through snow and thaw, summer storms, and autumn winds, the logging machine remained unmoved, yet somehow bore new marks each season, as if recording events invisible to observers. Ice formed along its treads and joints, only to melt into rivulets that darkened the rusted metal. Leaves collected in cavities decayed and scattered once more. Over the years, minor landslides and shifting soil had altered its angle slightly, but never displaced it entirely. These changes were subtle, almost imperceptible day to day. Yet their accumulation over decades made the machine seem both frozen and strangely alive to time. Its interaction with the environment suggested a narrative that the eye could only guess. And for every visible mark, innumerable unseen forces had likely left their trace. Its stillness in the midst of a living forest created a silent paradox, an artifact of human industry and intention, now surrendered entirely to the quiet unpredictability of nature. Once a symbol of ambition, utility, and control, it had become a monument to uncertainty, a relic whose original purpose had been rendered irrelevant. The juxtaposition of human engineering against the untamed forest evoked a peculiar tension, as if the machine were quietly resisting its erasure while simultaneously succumbing to it. Its presence invited reflection on the impermanence of human endeavors, but it did so without moralizing or explanation, leaving observers with nothing but the weight of curiosity and the gravity of unanswered questions. Encountering it, explorers and hikers could sense the gravity of its presence. A story left untold, a decision unrecorded, compelling the mind to fill the empty spaces. Its scale, its abandonment, and the manner in which it had been absorbed into the forest created a psychological landscape as complex as the physical one it occupied. People could imagine accidents, emergencies, or deliberate acts. Yet, no one could verify any of these narratives. Rumors and speculation proliferated, but none touched the certainty of the machine's reality, and its enigmatic existence remained untouched by the conjecture surrounding it. The machine stood as a focal point for the unknown, a fixed object around which the forest won its ever-changing tapestry of growth, decay, and quiet intrigue. Years after being left, the machine remains still, a silent metallic witness whose history remains veiled in the shadows of the Copper River Basin, the midnight howls of the Tetland Refuge. A strange stillness hung over the spruce-lined ridges of Alaska's interior, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. In the dead hours of night, sounds could travel for miles. Yet the high-pitched howls reported near Tetland National Wildlife Refuge did not belong to the wilderness as anyone knew it. Sharp, piercing calls rose and fell in irregular sequences, drifting from ridge to ridge before vanishing into silence. They carried a resonance that did not match wolves, coyotes, or any other animal familiar to local hunters and biologists. Those who heard them spoke of an unplaceable quality, a tone that seemed almost too deliberate to be natural, as though the forest had found a voice of its own. Seasonal field biologists first encountered the phenomenon while monitoring the refuge's remote wetlands for migratory birds. One night, shortly after midnight, recording equipment captured a series of shrill cries. The first came suddenly, cutting through the usual chorus of nocturnal creatures, followed by a thinner, almost soprano-like second note. A third howl answered, lower in pitch, but carrying a strange, resonant timbre that confounded even seasoned observers. The sequence repeated intermittently for half an hour before fading, leaving only the heavy quiet of the boreal forest. Despite repeated attempts to match the recordings with known wildlife, nothing corresponded. Locals offered similar accounts, often dismissing them as wolves, though acknowledging the sound was not quite right. Hunters familiar with the low, mournful cries of wolves described these howls as sharper, more musical, almost intelligent in cadence. They seemed to move across the ridges, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, leaving no tracks, no signs of movement, nothing to indicate the presence of a living creature. Some speculated the calls were carried by wind or echoes from distant valleys. Yet those who'd studied sound in the region noted the purity and consistency of the tones, made natural distortion unlikely. The refuge itself spans hundreds of thousands of acres, a mosaic of spruce and aspen forests, wetlands, and braided river channels. Wildlife here includes lynx, moose, caribou, and numerous migratory birds. Sound travels far across the snow and marshes, and on winter nights, even a small noise can echo for miles. Yet the howls were different from ordinary wildlife calls, breaking through the forest in a way that seemed almost purposeful. Observers reported that during the recordings, the air seemed to carry a chill that had nothing to do with temperature, a weight that settled over the trees as if the forest had paused to listen. Efforts to capture further evidence yielded nothing. Biologists deployed additional recording devices along ridges and wetlands in subsequent summers. Infrared cameras and motion detectors monitored the areas where the sounds were first recorded. Weeks passed without a single repeat. The phenomenon seemed to exist only in fleeting moments, impossible to predict or approach, as though the sound had a will of its own, choosing when and where to manifest. Speculation arose among researchers. Could the calls come from an undiscovered species, one so elusive it left no tracks? Perhaps an unusual behavior of a known animal produced the tones under certain conditions, or could wind patterns, temperature inversions, or echoes somehow create the effect? None of these explanations satisfied the biologists. The recorded howls were clean, deliberate, and distinct in frequency, unlike the distorted or scattered sounds typical of natural amplification through this forest. Indigenous hunters who know Tetlin well sometimes speak of forest spirits or unseen presences, voices that move through the woods but cannot be traced. While they do not claim the recorded howls are supernatural, they emphasize the forest is vast and layered with life and memory that humans rarely perceive. Oral histories describe entities that sing or call in ways humans cannot predict. And while these stories do not offer proof, they underscore how fragile the boundary between the known and unknown can feel in the deep boreal wilderness. Historical notes from refuge surveys in the 1980s and 1990s contain brief mentions of unusual vocalizations heard near wetland ridges at pre-dawn hours. At the time, they were dismissed as wind, distant wolves, or background noise, and follow-up studies were never conducted. Looking back, those early observers may have recorded the same enigmatic sounds. Yet the lack of repeatable evidence left them as footnotes in an otherwise ordinary log of wildlife activity. One summer, a visitor driving along the Alaska Highway near Tetlin's southern edge reported hearing a three-note howl that seemed to circle the vehicle before vanishing. They stopped and listened, briefly convinced they heard footsteps crunching in snow behind the tree line. When they investigated, nothing was found. Attempts to confirm the sighting with refuge officials revealed no similar reports. The forest remained silent except for its usual nocturnal rhythms. For those who have heard the original recording, the experience lingers long after the sounds fade. It is not merely an animal cry or environmental noise. It occupies a liminal space where science hesitates, leaving a sense that something in the forest is observing, listening, or calling without revealing itself. Even trained ears struggle to assign the sound to any known creature or natural phenomenon. The mystery of the Tetlin howls remains unresolved, an auditory ghost lingering in the midnight hours of Alaska's boreal forest. Their origin, purpose, and meaning elude explanation, defying both human and scientific understanding. Sometimes when the wind is right, the forest exhales a single piercing note that reminds those nearby that the wilderness still keeps its secrets well. The drowned cabin near the Upper China. Even in the quiet of early morning, the Upper China felt strangely hollow, the usual hum of wildlife reduced to a faint whisper. A Forest Service ranger, making his routine rounds along the remote back trails, spotted a small cabin in the distance, tucked between moss-covered logs and marshy patches. At first glance, it appeared ordinary. Yet, as he drew closer, it became clear that something about the structure defied explanation, its lower walls disappearing into the soil without a trace of flood or thaw. The air around it felt heavier, damp, but still, as though the forest had folded in on itself to hide the anomaly. The ranger noted that the rough-hewn logs of the walls remained remarkably intact, their corners sharp and stable, yet the foundation had sunken in a way that suggested the earth itself had quietly swallowed part of the building overnight. Every step toward the cabin heightened a sense of disorientation. The roof line appeared level while the lower beams seemed to vanish, creating a visual paradox that unsettled the observer. Moss and fallen leaves gathered unnaturally around the edges, clinging to the sunken portions as if the soil had molded itself precisely around the structure. He stepped onto the threshold and tested the door, which swung smoothly on its hinges, unweathered, while the floorboards beneath him shifted unevenly, as if the cabin were resisting collapse even as the soil claimed it. Inside, dust lay undisturbed on a single plank, yet the space felt oddly constricted at the edges where the floor had tilted into the ground. The walls were straight, the roof sturdy, and the chimney intact, as though someone had carefully preserved the cabin only to leave it sinking silently into the earth. The ranger could not find any evidence of rot, fire, or flood damage that might explain the anomaly. Patches of moss and lichen crept along the cabin's lower beams where the earth had pulled away. Yet the surrounding riverbank, marsh, and forest floor showed no signs of erosion, water damage, or environmental disturbance that might explain its sunken state. The soil was firm, cold, and undisturbed beyond the immediate area of the cabin. Seasonal throwing patterns in the boreal forest typically cause uneven settling or pooling of water. Yet nothing of the sort was visible here. Small animals normally active in early morning avoided the area, leaving an unnatural silence that stretched across the marsh. Longtime hunters and trappers in the region recalled cabins built along the Upper China decades ago. Yet none had ever sunken in this peculiar fashion, and no stories passed down could explain the precise and silent submersion of this one. Oral histories included warnings of soft ground near wetlands or spots where snow melt occasionally undermined structures, but every natural explanation fell short of accounting for the cabin's perfect roofline and intact interior. Locals described the area as remote, but historically traversable, with the occasional cabin built by trappers or seasonal fishermen. Yet none exhibited this kind of unexplained disappearance into the earth. The ranger called in colleagues and Forest Service survey teams who measured soil composition, checked for throwing permafrost, and examined the water table. Yet every logical explanation dissolved under scrutiny. Surveys confirmed that the surrounding soil had not shifted significantly, and no heavy rainfall, flooding, or unusual melt events had occurred in recent years. Geological records showed no evidence of minor landslides or subsidence in the immediate area. The cabin had settled without warning, without precedent, leaving experts both baffled and uneasy. As they walked the perimeter, a quiet unease settled over the group, the forest seeming to watch the cabin, the stillness of the marsh emphasizing the impossibility of what lay before them. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move through the low-lying trees nearby. The usual sounds of birds or rustling wildlife were muted, and the faint drip of condensation from morning dew felt disproportionately loud against the silence. The team felt as though they were intruding on something not meant to be witnessed. Tiny ridges in the mud hinted at movement, yet no footprints, tire tracks, or animal paths led to or from the cabin, leaving only questions etched in the soil and the persistent feeling that something had passed unnoticed. Water pooled in narrow channels along the sunken edges, forming irregular patterns that resisted explanation. Clumps of moss near the corners seemed unnaturally dense, as though the ground had shifted subtly over time. But the rest of the forest floor remained uniform, showing no sign of disturbance. Every step back from the cabin reinforced the sense that the anomaly was deliberate, not accidental. The sunlight glinted off the roof, highlighting a contradiction that defied explanation. The structure above ground remained perfectly preserved, while below it, the foundation had been quietly consumed by the earth itself. Observers could not reconcile the sight with their understanding of soil mechanics or environmental forces. The cabin seemed suspended in an invisible tension between natural law and something else. An object caught between the human world and a quiet, indifferent wilderness that refused to offer answers. The cabin rested half-buried in silence, as if the land itself had decided it must vanish, leaving anyone who stumbled upon it to wonder whether the forest had claimed it or some other force entirely. The wandering beacon near Manly Hot Springs. A pale, pulsing glow drifted across the northern tree line, slipping between spruce and birch as if it were moving under its own will, entirely untethered to the forest floor or any visible source. The night air above Manly Hot Springs was crisp and still, carrying the scent of melting snow and the faint tang of river water. Yet nothing in the environment seemed to account for the movement of the light. Shadows stretched and contracted in its wake, bending strangely around tree trunks and boulders, creating a sense that the forest itself was participating in an unseen choreography. Occasionally, the glow reflected off patches of ice or thin snow along the river, creating momentary illusions of multiple lights dancing in unison, only for those reflections to vanish without explanation. Bush pilots flying routine routes over the area were among the first to notice the phenomenon, tracking the light through valleys and over frozen streams, only to find that no flight path, tower, or reflective surface could account for its presence. One pilot recounted seeing the glow suddenly appear over a ridge before darting across a hollow where trees were thickest, moving with a fluidity that defied altitude and wind conditions. Several attempts were made to coordinate multiple aircraft for simultaneous observation. Yet even with radio communication and overlapping flight paths, the light seemed to evade every effort at precise tracking. The beacon shifted in hue and intensity, sometimes appearing as a soft white pulse, at other times flaring with a sudden amber glow. Its rhythm was irregular, pulsing faster or slower without warning, as though it were responding to some imperceptible signal. Ground observers described the light as casting elongated shadows that bent unnaturally across tree trunks and small depressions in the terrain. Its erratic behavior made it nearly impossible to anticipate where it would emerge next, leaving those attempting to follow it disoriented and increasingly uncertain of distance and direction. Locals attempting to follow the glow on foot found that it seemed to advance and retreat at impossible speeds. Hunters and trappers described chasing it through shallow marshes and over low ridges, only to arrive at empty clearings where the glow had vanished. Sometimes it appeared above the river, other times perched impossibly at top distant hills. Even experienced outdoorsmen familiar with the region's valleys and ridges found themselves questioning what they had just seen, their compasses and pacing unable to reconcile with the light's sudden relocations. Occasional photographs and short video clips captured the glow as a dim orb against the darkness of the Boreal Forest. Yet even with modern lenses, long exposures, and infrared equipment, its exact source could not be determined. Images revealed the light's movement, its intermittent pulses, and proximity to tree lines, but none clarified whether it originated from the ground, treetops, or sky. Attempts to recreate the phenomenon under controlled conditions failed, leaving technical experts baffled. The recording served only to reinforce the mystery, offering visual evidence while leaving fundamental questions unresolved. Residents spoke of subtle anomalies in the area that coincided with the beacon's appearances. Some noted unusual reflections on frozen ponds, fleeting glimmers that could not be traced to any object or light source. Others recalled nights when compasses wavered or small instruments gave inconsistent readings. Hunters noted that the glow sometimes followed the course of animal trails or meandering waterways without any discernible pattern. Oral accounts emphasized the frequency with which the light could appear and vanish within minutes, leaving those who witnessed it with a persistent sense of being observed. Meteorologists and astronomers considered atmospheric phenomena, auroral reflections, and distant aircraft. Yet measurements of light intensity, trajectory, and timing failed to align with any known explanation. Even the aurora borealis visible in the region could not account for the movement, brightness, or erratic timing of the beacon. Investigators noted that sightings did not correspond to satellite activity or documented flight paths, nor did they match meteorological or astronomical events. All known natural or human causes fell short, leaving the light's origin unexplained. The light's path exhibited no discernible pattern. It appeared over valleys, along ridges, and occasionally above the river itself, each sighting as fleeting and unpredictable as the last. Observers attempted to correlate its movement with topography, weather, or human activity. Yet each effort yielded only fragmented observations. Even repeated sightings on consecutive nights offered little in the way of a consistent trajectory. The beacon could vanish behind a dense thicket, only to re-emerge in a clearing hundreds of meters away, its motion precise yet inexplicable. Repeated sightings left even experienced pilots and field workers unsettled. The forest around Manly Hot Springs took on a spectral quality under the shifting glow, as though the land itself were participating in the light's journey. Nights when the glow appeared were described as heavier, more charged, with shadows lengthened and contours of the landscape exaggerated by its presence. Those who had tracked it spoke of a quiet tension, a sense of anticipation, and a lingering unease that persisted long after the light had disappeared beyond the horizon. No matter how closely it was followed, the wandering beacon eluded explanation, leaving only questions suspended in the night air above the boreal expanse. The rapid forest dies off near the Koyuk River. The dense spruce and fir of the Koyuk River boreal expanse stood in stark contrast one spring as entire swathes of trees dropped needles and darkened abruptly, their lifeless forms rising against the still green forest around them. From a distance, the affected patches appeared almost like burns against the otherwise flourishing landscape. Yet, there was no evidence of fire. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and melting snow, and the usual rustle of wind through needles seemed muted, as though the forest itself had quieted in response to the change. Subtle shifts in light and shadow revealed the jagged edges of the dying zones, where living and dead trees stood side by side, emphasizing the abruptness of the transformation. Field biologists conducting routine forest health surveys were the first to notice the anomaly, counting dozens of trees stripped of vitality across plots that had appeared normal only months earlier. Teams returned repeatedly to confirm their observations, taking detailed notes on the species affected, primarily spruce and fir, and recording locations for later mapping. The initial reports were met with disbelief. Colleagues questioned whether insect infestations or fungal outbreaks had been overlooked, but preliminary inspections revealed no outward signs of pests or disease, leaving investigators perplexed. The affected area stretched over several hundred m, the dead trees forming a patchwork of silence in the otherwise vibrant forest. With edges so sharply defined, they seemed almost deliberate rather than natural. From aerial surveys, The die-off resembled geometric anomalies, with blocks and lines of dead timber interrupting the natural flow of the boreal landscape. Snow melt in adjacent creeks reflected the still bare branches, enhancing the eerie visual contrast. The suddenness of the change and the clarity of its boundaries made it unlike any ecological disturbance typically observed in Alaska's interior forests. Careful inspection revealed that the spruce and fir trunks retained intact bark and structural integrity, with no signs of insect infestation, fungal disease, or fire damage, leaving investigators confused by the sudden mortality. Needles lay brittle on the forest floor, some yellowed, others brown, yet no pathogen could be detected in samples collected in situ. Branches and root systems appeared healthy at first glance, making the speed of the die-off even more baffling. Experts noted that while some forest mortality can occur gradually from drought, disease, or age, the simultaneous collapse of vitality across multiple mature trees was unprecedented in this region. Soil and water samples were collected measuring pH, nutrient content, and moisture levels. Yet, no contamination or unusual chemical presence could account for the swift die-off. Groundwater and river samples were analyzed for heavy metals and other potential toxins, all returning within expected ranges. Temperature logs and permafrost assessments showed no evidence of abrupt throwing or frost heaving that could disrupt root systems. Even microclimatic data, including wind, humidity, and sunlight exposure, offered no clear pattern. Every conventional explanation fell short, deepening the sense of mystery surrounding the affected area. Longtime trappers and hunters noted subtle changes weeks prior: diminished bird activity, unusually quiet marshes, and areas where undergrowth seemed to wilt before the trees themselves showed signs of stress. Some remembered paths where snowpack appeared slightly discolored or where moss and lichen had lost vibrancy. While anecdotal, these observations suggested that the anomaly had not emerged entirely without warning. Yet, the factors driving it remained imperceptible to those who live closest to the forest. Laboratory tests of wood and needle tissue revealed no pathogens or toxins, and experts in forestry and ecology acknowledged that the combination of factors normally responsible for die-offs was absent in this case. Microscopic examinations found cellular structures intact, sap chemistry within normal ranges, and no sign of disease vectors. Analyses conducted over several weeks confirmed the absence of chemical residues or airborne contaminants. Specialists concluded that the cause was not only unidentifiable, but inconsistent with any known patterns of ecological collapse, leaving the event in a category of uncertainty few had encountered. Mapping of the dead zones highlighted irregular clusters and abrupt boundaries with healthy forest immediately adjacent to the blighted patches, defying patterns seen in conventional ecological disturbances. Some areas showed linear arrangements, almost as if the die-off followed hidden contours or invisible channels across the land. Investigators attempted to correlate the patterns with topography, soil type, and water drainage, but no connection emerged. The forest seemed to alternate between life and death with no apparent logic, creating a sense that the anomaly had a deliberate, if unfathomable, structure. Teams surveying the impacted zones noted a quiet unease upon walking the affected areas. The forest felt alien and strangely inert, as if the usual rhythms of growth and decay had been suspended or rewritten in these pockets. Even experienced ecologists noted that the lack of audible wildlife, the sudden stasis of undergrowth, and the brittle, lifeless canopy produced an atmosphere more unsettling than any storm or fire. The visual contrast between vibrant and dead zones created a dissonance that lingered long after field teams departed, embedding questions about causality and ecological balance in their minds. After countless studies and careful observation, the cause of the rapid die-off remained invisible, leaving the Kayak River forest with a silent scar and questions that refused to fade. The vanishing herd of the western interior. From the low-flying survey plane, The rolling snow fields of Alaska's western interior stretched endlessly, punctuated by the slow movement of a small caribou herd grazing across the open expanse, unaware that their presence would soon defy explanation. The winter sun cast pale light over the frozen terrain, making the subtle undulations of ridges and valleys more pronounced, while pockets of ice along creek beds reflected faint glimmers. Snow drifts formed irregular patterns across gentle slopes, and scattered spruce hummocks interrupted the monotony of white, creating natural corridors for wildlife. Observers noted the synchronized grazing of the herd, the gentle sway of antlers in adult males, and the careful movements of calves as they followed their mothers across the windswept snow. Wildlife biologists had been tracking the herd over consecutive days, recording GPS positions and herd composition, noting typical behaviors as the animals moved between ridges and sheltered valleys. Each flight included detailed photographic documentation, mapping the spatial distribution and timing the herd's movements. Analysts paid attention to grazing rotations, pauses, and signs of alertness, marking instances when individuals lifted heads to scan for predators. Even from hundreds of meters above, the herd's behavior seemed ordinary, following seasonal patterns observed in previous surveys. Yet, the observers remained attentive, aware that the western interior often held unexpected challenges for wildlife. On the following flight, observers were stunned to find the herd had vanished, leaving the snowfield empty with no tracks leading to forested edges or distant meadows. The emptiness was immediate and disorienting. The space that had held dozens of caribou now revealed only unbroken snow and wind-shaped drifts. GPS overlays and photographic comparisons confirmed the anomaly, showing the herd in one location yesterday and nowhere today. The lack of even a single set of hoofprints or disturbed undergrowth contradicted all expectations based on migration and foraging behavior. In a coordinated effort, teams scrambled to search from both the ground and air, following established migration corridors and examining every hollow, creek, and tree line. Yet the landscape yielded nothing to indicate the herd's passage. Ground crews moved slowly, carefully scanning snow drifts and shallow valleys, while small aircraft circled at varying altitudes, checking ridges and forest edges. The terrain presented challenges. Hidden marshes beneath thin ice, windswept ridges that erased tracks overnight, and dense clusters of spruce that could obscure small groups. Despite extensive coverage and repeated flyovers, searchers found no indication of movement feeding or resting by the herd. The region was known for sparse vegetation during late winter, with forage concentrated in sheltered meadows and caribou typically migrating in predictable patterns, making the sudden disappearance all the more perplexing. Observers reviewed decades of historical data, noting how caribou relied on specific corridors for food and safety, particularly during snow-heavy winters. Seasonal migrations, predator avoidance, and thermal conditions were all accounted for in past studies, and none of these factors could explain a sudden total disappearance of a cohesive herd. Survey grids and flight paths showed no evidence of scattered animals, tracks, or broken snow, as if the herd had simply ceased to exist within the observed territory. In areas where soft snow should have preserved even the smallest hoof printing, nothing appeared. Observers checked wind and snow drift patterns to rule out erasers by weather. Yet the consistency of absence across multiple sectors remained baffling. Lines of undisturbed snow ran uninterrupted for hundreds of meters, cutting across areas that should have shown feeding or resting signs. Pilots and rangers described a profound unease as they scanned the horizon, realizing that an entire herd, normally a moving mass of life against the snow, had been erased from view without any logical explanation. Experienced trackers felt a rare discomfort at seeing patterns of movement completely interrupted. The contrast between the vibrant activity observed just a day earlier and the void now visible from above created a sense of unreality, as though the forest and snowfields themselves had absorbed the animals. while temporary dispersion during storms or predator activity occasionally scatters individuals. The sudden absence of an entire cohesive group was unprecedented in records of Alaskan wildlife monitoring. Biologists compared the incident to past dispersals and found no parallels. Typically, a herd will fragment, leaving observable traces. Yet this disappearance occurred with no detectable dispersal pattern or tracks. The anomaly defied ecological reasoning and raised questions about unseen influences on animal behavior in remote boreal regions. The vanishing challenged assumptions about movement, navigation, and survival in the boreal interior, highlighting how much remains unknown about even the most observable large mammals. Every hypothesis from disease to predator pressure was tested and eliminated. Analysts considered environmental factors, yet snow conditions, forage distribution, and shelter availability aligned with prior years. The incident underscored the limitations of even the most detailed observation methods when confronting vast and unpredictable wilderness. No trace, no tracks, and no warning marked their disappearance, leaving the western interior snowfields silent and the fate of the herd an enduring enigma. The strange tonal hum beneath the Tanana Flats. An unbroken hum lingered over the frozen expanse of the Tanana Flats, audible to soldiers stationed at the edge of the boreal interior, yet impossible to trace to any identifiable source. A sound both steady and strangely pulsating that would not relent. On clear days, when the pale winter sun glinted off snow and ice, the emptiness of the flat land seemed amplified, and the hum, low and continuous, carried across miles of open terrain. Those who first noticed it described a vibration that was not merely heard, but felt. A subtle resonance that threaded through boots, sleds, and even the cold metal of vehicles. Despite repeated listening and careful attention, the tone resisted classification, seeming to belong neither to the earth nor the air above it. The earliest accounts came from personnel assigned to routine monitoring, noting the hum at dawn and dusk, times when the flatlands seemed otherwise silent, and describing a low-frequency vibration that seemed to pass through the snow and ice beneath their boots. Officers and surveyors recorded their observations in logs, noting both the duration and intensity of the sound, often with a sense of unease at its persistence. Local bush pilots mentioned hearing the hum from the air, a faint, steady drone that seemed to follow river channels without originating from any visible source. Each report emphasized the bewildering regularity of the phenomenon alongside its complete elusiveness. The sound defied classification. The tone possessed mechanical steadiness without rhythm, and while it carried across miles, no discernible origin could be determined, fading and returning without pattern. Some described it as a low hum similar to a distant engine idling, yet with a tonal clarity that refused to match any human machinery. Others likened it to the vibration of the ground itself. Though geologists familiar with the flatlands noted that the permafrost and shallow soils could not generate such a continuous resonance. Even seasoned surveyors who had traversed these flats for decades agreed that they had never encountered anything resembling the tonal hum. Acoustic specialists deployed sensitive recording equipment and ground sensors to measure vibrations, compiling dozens of hours of data. Yet every reading only confirmed what locals had sensed, without revealing a cause or consistent source. Microphones, accelerometers, and seismic devices all captured the persistent frequency, though analyses revealed no correlation with known environmental or man-made phenomena. Attempts to isolate the signal, including triangulation with multiple instruments across a wide area, consistently failed, leaving a patchwork of inconclusive data that only deepened the mystery. The Tanana Flats are interlaced with shallow rivers, frozen bogs, and scattered spruce hummocks, a terrain that amplified echoes yet produced no natural resonance capable of generating the hum, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. Wind patterns and topographical features were analyzed to see if the sound might be an acoustic artifact, but prevailing winds, river courses, and snow drifts could not account for the steady tone. Even in the quietest sectors, where trees and hummocks absorbed sound, the hump persisted, constant and unyielding, as if the earth itself were producing a hidden vibration. Those who spent prolonged hours near the source described subtle disorientation, a pressure behind the ears, and a faint nausea, sensations that vanished when moving beyond the area, emphasizing how the phenomenon existed without leaving tangible traces. Reports of headaches, vertigo, and mild unease were consistent among soldiers, surveyors, and pilots, yet none linked these effects to any known environmental hazard. The psychological impact of the sound, persistent yet unlocatable, heightened the impression of the flats as a space simultaneously vast, empty, and unknowable. The hum's intensity would fluctuate inexplicably, sometimes rising to a perceptible drone and at other times diminishing to nearly silence. Yet repeated attempts to triangulate the source consistently failed, deepening the sense of mystery. Some surveyors reported moments when the hum seemed to shift in directional strength without any wind change or detectable movement across the terrain. Teams tried repositioning sensors and conducting repeated measurements at different times of day, only to find that the phenomenon followed no predictable schedule or geographic pattern. Military engineers, geologists, and residents compared the hum to microisms, wind interactions with frozen terrain, and industrial noise. Yet none match the steady, isolated vibration documented across the flat lands. Natural explanations from river ice cracking to subtle tectonic activity were considered and rejected after careful study. Similarly, anthropogenic sources were ruled out. The area was remote, largely unpopulated, and free from heavy machinery capable of producing such persistent acoustic effects. The more comparisons were made, the less the phenomenon resembled anything understood. Throughout weeks, months, and even years, reports persisted. Each encounter reinforces the anomaly's persistence while simultaneously underscoring the inability of science or local knowledge to fully explain it, leaving observers frustrated and unsettled. Some attempted to interpret the hum as a warning or a signal from the Earth itself, though these notions remained speculative. The tonal quality, duration, and inexplicable localization of the hum continued to challenge the limits of auditory and environmental research. And yet, no definitive source emerged despite decades of observation and documentation. The strange tonal hum of the Tanana Flats continues to resonate through the frozen expanse, a sound without origin, source, or explanation, lingering like a question that refuses to be answered. The abandoned snowcat on the Dalton Corridor. The GPS monitor blinked insistently, showing the snowcat moving steadily along the Dalton Corridor despite the absence of any operator in the cab. A record that immediately drew the attention of supervisors and engineers. For field teams accustomed to the regular rhythms of remote equipment, the anomaly was striking. The Dalton Corridor, a stretch of road cut through boreal forest and tundra, had long been monitored for vehicle operation and maintenance. Yet never before had a machine appeared to move autonomously. Every sensor, from engine telemetry to GPS data, indicated activity, while the cab itself remained empty. The incongruity between observed movement and human absence created an immediate sense of alarm and disbelief among those responsible for monitoring the route. Typically used for snow clearing and transport across remote stretches, snowcats are heavily monitored machines equipped with redundant controls and designed to halt if unattended, making this movement entirely anomalous. The vehicles are built to withstand deep snow, steep inclines, and sub-zero temperatures. Yet their systems require an operator to engage the throttle and controls. Onboard logging devices record speed, engine load, and track angle, all intended to ensure safe operation in harsh conditions. Engineers who reviewed the initial data were struck not only by the unexpected movement, but by the absence of any fault codes or emergency triggers that might have explained a runaway machine. Responders arriving on site found deep snow drifts and scattered ice patches, conditions that should have immobilized the vehicle, yet tracks indicated it had traveled miles as though guided by some unseen hand. The corridor winds between sparse stands of spruce and frozen wetlands, terrain that typically challenges even experienced operators. Survey teams carefully followed the tracks, noting the precision with which the snowcat had navigated corners and inclines, leaving impressions in snow that were unbroken and continuous, with no evidence of erratic slippage or loss of control. The snow itself appeared untouched elsewhere, suggesting the vehicle's path had emerged with purpose rather than random drift. The snowcat sat idling perfectly, engine warm and lights functional, with its tracks leading to nowhere and the cab empty, leaving investigators to confront a reality that defied conventional explanation. Crew members approached cautiously, documenting the scene and taking repeated photographs. They checked the cab for signs of forced entry or mechanical tampering, finding none. The vehicle's controls were disengaged, steering centered, and no personal items were left behind. Despite hours of observation, the snowcat remained in place, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Analysis of telemetry data, GPS logs, and onboard monitoring systems confirmed the vehicle's path and operation. While environmental factors such as wind, slope, and snow density offered no plausible means of unassisted movement, engineers traced the GPS coordinates along the corridor, confirming that the snowcat had followed a precise course for miles, accelerating, decelerating, and making turns consistent with operator input. And conditions that could have caused natural movement, such as avalanches, ice slides, or strong gusts, were absent. The precision and continuity of the journey left investigators with no mechanical, environmental, or human explanation. Meticulous documentation by engineers and field operators included photographing every angle, measuring track depth, and attempting repeated starts. Yet each observation reinforced the impossible nature of what had occurred. Maintenance logs indicated the vehicle had been fully operational the previous day, with routine inspections confirming that all sensors, brakes, and drive systems functioned within normal parameters. No anomalies had been reported that could account for autonomous movement. The meticulous record-keeping of snowcat operations provided a clear picture of normal activity, highlighting just how inexplicable this incident had become. Hypotheses emerged quickly from mechanical failure to remote error. Yet each was systematically eliminated after careful examination of controls, sensors, and the surrounding terrain, leaving no clear explanation. Some considered a rare electronic glitch or feedback loop within the engine control system, while others speculated about human error in telemetry interpretation. Every suggestion was weighed against physical evidence and digital records, yet none aligned with the actual sequence of events recorded by multiple independent monitoring systems. The more theories were considered, the more puzzling the situation became. The Dalton Corridor, long a site of remote operations and rugged monitoring, had never recorded an incident of this nature, highlighting the peculiarity of a machine behaving independently in a landscape otherwise subject to predictable environmental forces. Operators noted that the corridor's isolation amplified both the logistical and psychological impact of such an event. Traveling alone along miles of treeline and frozen wetland is routine, but encountering a machine that appeared to move without command introduced a rare tension, underscoring how the remote boreal interior can amplify even mundane anomalies into compelling mysteries. Consistent inspections and operator interviews confirmed the snowcat's journey was unaccounted for, and the story circulated among field personnel as a baffling anomaly resistant to definitive explanation. Specialists reviewed video logs, sensor data, and personal accounts, yet no evidence suggested tampering, sabotage, or natural forces capable of propelling the vehicle. Conversations with seasoned operators reinforced the strangeness of the event, many recalling that nothing in their decades of experience could account for the combination of movement, precision, and absence of an operator. The abandoned snowcat continues to stand as a silent testament to a movement that defied logic, leaving only tracks in the snow and questions in its wake. The unexplained whiteout near the Yukon River cliffs. A blinding brightness swallowed the cliffs along the Yukon River, and within moments, boars found themselves enveloped in a whiteness so complete that the familiar shoreline vanished entirely, marking the beginning of what would become known as the unexplained whiteout near the Yukon River cliffs. Those navigating the winding river were suddenly confronted with a visual void, a transformation that unfolded in seconds and erased every recognizable feature of the terrain. The cliffs, normally a reliable guide, disappeared into featureless illumination, leaving even seasoned travelers struggling to orient themselves. It was a fleeting phenomenon. Yet the suddenness and completeness of the visual erasure left a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. The river corridor is usually characterized by crisp clarity, with the jagged cliffs and pine-toned banks offering unbroken lines of sight for miles, making the abrupt disappearance of all visual reference points profoundly disorienting. Clear air and steady currents are a hallmark of the region, allowing boars to anticipate bends, eddies, and shows well in advance. To encounter a condition where depth perception, distance, and direction all collapsed was outside the realm of expected river navigation. Those on the water quickly recognized that normal markers of travel were gone, and the landscape they relied upon to judge speed and orientation had vanished entirely. Travelers noted the shift occurred instantaneously, 1 second navigating clear waters, the next confronting a blinding void where familiar landmarks dissolved into featureless white. Reactions varied between stunned silence and frantic attempts to regain bearings. Some instinctively slowed their vessels, while others turned on navigation lights or scanned for radio signals from nearby stations. The suddenness heightened anxiety as the human mind struggles to interpret a sudden removal of all visual cues, leaving perception unnamed in an environment that otherwise demands constant attention. The whiteness was not accompanied by snowfall or fog, and yet it obscured everything, flattening distance, erasing depth, and rendering the river itself nearly invisible beneath a blanket of luminous haze. Water and sky seemed to merge, making it impossible to distinguish where one ended and the other began. Sunlight filtered through the anomaly in a diffuse uniform glow, stripping away shadows and erasing texture from every surface. Even familiar rocks and tree clusters became featureless, leaving witnesses with a landscape that was simultaneously present and absent, a contradiction that unsettled the senses. Hands instinctively reached for railings and eyes strained against the glare, while the boars attempted to maintain direction, their senses unable to reconcile the stark contradiction between motion and perception. The river continued to move, carrying vessels forward, but without reference points, velocity and orientation became ambiguous. Some relied on sound and tactile feedback, the gentle lapping of water against hulls, the feel of oars or throttle to navigate through a visual void that offered no reassurance. The disorientation was compounded by the isolation of the corridor, miles from settlements where assistance would be slow to arrive. After the whiteout lifted as suddenly as it appeared, measurements of air temperature, wind speed, and humidity revealed nothing unusual, leaving meteorologists puzzled by a phenomenon that existed but left no trace in conventional data. The instruments recorded conditions typical of a clear day along the Yukon, with no evidence of fog banks, atmospheric inversions, or reflective ice formations that could account for the intense localized whiteness. Observers repeatedly compared notes, confirming that the event had been both real and inexplicable, a challenge to both perception and scientific explanation. Speculation ranged from river mist, intensified by sunlight, to localized temperature inversions. Yet none of the typical environmental explanations matched the precision, scale, and duration reported by multiple witnesses. Meteorologists noted that while low-lying fogs or ice mists are common in the region during certain times of the year, these phenomena do not produce the instantaneous featureless whiteout described. Pilots who had flown over the cliffs in similar conditions corroborated that visibility and light conditions were normally predictable and stable, further emphasizing the anomaly's uniqueness. In certain secluded sections of the Yukon, guides reported similar events where travelers experienced fleeting visual erasure that lasted only minutes before disappearing, as if the terrain itself were hiding its features. While anecdotal, these repeated accounts suggest a pattern. The whiteout is not a single occurrence, but a sporadic localized phenomenon capable of removing visual reference without altering surrounding weather. The reports scattered over decades describe a phenomenon that remains unrecorded in conventional meteorological studies, existing instead in the experiences of those who traverse the river's remote reaches. Individuals experiencing the whiteout reported a disorienting vertigo, a sensation of detachment from spatial reference, and an enduring unease that persisted once the environment stabilized. Bores recounted that even after sight was restored, it took minutes to regain a sense of distance and direction. Some felt as though the river had shifted subtly during the anomaly, though instruments showed no measurable movement. The experience lingered as an unsettling memory, demonstrating how sudden environmental phenomena can disrupt not only navigation, but the human sense of reality. In a region defined by extreme light, long winters, and the interplay of ice and water, the Yukon whiteout stands apart, a mysterious visual anomaly that challenges assumptions about perception and the behavior of the natural world. Unlike snowstorms, fog, or auroral displays, this occurrence alters a familiar landscape in a matter of seconds, leaving no permanent trace and challenging observers to reconcile experience with the data recorded. The cliffs, the river, and the surrounding forest return to their ordinary forms, yet the event remains vivid for those who endured it, a reminder of nature's capacity to confound even the most prepared traveler. Even under rigorous observation and repeated accounts, the whiteout defied explanation, confounding researchers and travelers alike with its fleeting yet unmistakable presence. Experts continue to study the area for conditions that could explain the localized visual erasure, but no combination of atmospheric or environmental factors has yet satisfied the unusual characteristics recorded by multiple observers. The phenomenon persists as a rare and enigmatic feature of the Yukon landscape. The cliffs return to their familiar outline if the memory of the sudden featureless white lingered, a reminder that even the most measured landscapes can vanish without explanation. The burned in symbols near the Kanishna Hills. Foresters moving through the dense pines of the Kanishna Hills stumbled upon scorch marks that seemed deliberately arranged, immediately drawing attention to what would later be called the burned in symbols near the Kanishna Hills. The discovery occurred along a stretch of forest rarely traversed except for occasional forestry surveys, and the initial shock came from the incongruity of the marks with the otherwise unremarkable surroundings. What at first appeared to be accidental charred bark revealed a series of repeated patterns geometric in nature that could not be explained by lightning, wildfire, or other natural forces. Those present immediately sensed that the forest had concealed a secret, a subtle anomaly that demanded scrutiny and documentation. The surrounding forest appeared ordinary at first glance, with spruce and birch interspersed across gentle slopes, yet the consistency of the scorch patterns contrasted sharply with the randomness of natural growth and decay. Needles, moss, and undergrowth grew in normal density around the trunks, showing no signs of fire damage or heat stress, and the soil was undisturbed. The forest canopy filtered the early afternoon sun into fragmented shafts, highlighting the symbols with an eerie precision, as if the environment itself were framing the markings for observation. To foresters accustomed to subtle variations in tree bark and forest composition, this anomaly felt deliberate and out of place. A deliberate interruption in the otherwise natural order of the boreal landscape. The marks were etched into tree bark with a precision that suggested design rather than accident. Geometric forms repeating at intervals that no fire, lightning strike, or natural process could explain. Triangles, rectangles, and circles appeared singly and in combination, occasionally intersecting or aligning along invisible axes that observers could only trace with careful measurement. The spacing between symbols was uniform enough to suggest intention, yet there were no signs of human tools, no footprints, and no campfires nearby. The forest seemed to have silently borne witness to an event that left its mark, and then retreated without a trace of the process itself. Triangles, circles, and interconnected lines were seared into trunks without evidence of flame spread or damage to adjacent foliage, leaving observers puzzled by the impossibility of their creation under normal conditions. The burn marks penetrated the bark superficially, leaving the wood beneath untouched, and the edges were crisp rather than singed, defying known combustion patterns. Even the smallest branches adjacent to the markings remained unaffected, their needles vibrant and green. This selective application of heat or energy suggested a precision no conventional fire could achieve, and the observers felt the forest around them thrum with an uncanny stillness, as if holding its breath in recognition of the anomaly. Examining the soil and undergrowth revealed no residual heat, no traces of accelerants, and no signs of human activity nearby, deepening the sense of an inexplicable occurrence. The ground showed no tracks, no burn scars, and no evidence of tools or machinery that might explain the markings. Moss, fallen needles, and lichen all remained intact, further emphasizing the contrast between the scorched symbols and their untouched surroundings. Foresters recorded measurements meticulously, noting angles, dimensions, and relative placement. But the absence of any causal agent made the task frustratingly incomplete. Historical records and forestry logs contained no mention of similar marks, suggesting these symbols had appeared suddenly without precedent or known cause. Archives from past surveys, photographs, and ranger reports offered no reference to such phenomena in the Kanishna Hills or surrounding boreal regions. Locals interviewed for historical context expressed surprise, but not disbelief, noting that the forest often seemed to harbor its own secret events, yet none could recall anything remotely resembling these burned symbols. The abrupt emergence of these markings placed them outside both ordinary human activity and known natural processes. Upon discovering the symbols, those present reported an uneasy fascination, recording measurements, sketches, and photographs while struggling to rationalize the precise yet untraceable markings. Some compared the designs to runes, symbolic diagrams, or abstract geometric art, but none fit any recognized pattern or cultural motif, indigenous or otherwise. The foresters moved carefully among the trees, taking care not to disturb the surrounding undergrowth. Yet the sense of intrusion into a space that had already been altered by unknown hands left a lingering tension. Every observation reinforced the paradox. The marks were deliberate, yet no maker could be identified. Samples taken from the scorched bark and surrounding material underwent laboratory testing, revealing no chemical residue or anomalies that could indicate conventional methods of burning or engraving. Analysts found only normal bark compounds, trace minerals consistent with regional soil, and no trace of human-applied chemicals. This absence of evidence for standard processes suggested a phenomenon that might involve heat, energy, or forces unrecognized by current understanding. The meticulous documentation by foresters and scientists further heightened the mystery, as every conventional explanation failed to account for the anomaly. Sunlight hitting the marks at certain angles created the illusion of depth and movement, altering perception and making the symbols appear almost alive within the still forest. Depending on the observer's position, Lines seem to shift slightly, triangles appear to rotate, and circles gleam as if capturing fragments of light from an unseen source. Even with photographic records, this optical effect was difficult to capture, leaving witnesses with an experience that was simultaneously visual, spatial, and almost tactile. The interplay between the natural light and the symbol's precision reinforced the impression that the forest itself had become a canvas for a phenomenon beyond ordinary comprehension. The burned symbols stood apart even among Alaska's boreal anomalies, a quiet testament to a phenomenon that defied natural explanation while blending seamlessly with the forest's ancient rhythms. Unlike sudden disappearances, unexplained lights, or anomalous sounds documented elsewhere, these marks were permanent yet silent, physical yet inexplicable. The forest density and isolation amplified the effect, creating a setting where human investigation felt both urgent and limited, as if the forest itself was selectively revealing its secrets. Comprehensive studies, careful documentation, and input from multiple experts still failed to explain the sudden appearance, precision, and lack of environmental disturbance associated with the symbols. Observers, both local and scientific, continued to return to the site, examining angles, patterns, and relationships between trees. Yet, every analysis returned the same conclusion. The phenomenon was deliberate and untraceable, visible, yet unexplained. The burned-in symbols remain a question lodged within the forest, a riddle that exists in the space between observation and understanding. The trees remained scarred with their enigmatic markings, a silent record of an event that left no footprints, no flames, and no answers. The endless whistle of the Arctic interior. Residents near Alakit reported a high piercing whistle that seemed to float across the boreal expanse without an identifiable source. A phenomenon later documented as the endless whistle of the Arctic interior. It was a sound that appeared spontaneously, often during calm nights when the forest seemed to hold its breath, drawing attention in a region where silence was more the norm than noise. At first, it was dismissed as the wind threading through distant ridges or the call of some unknown bird. But repeated occurrences across settlements suggested something more profound, a sustained note that defied known environmental or biological explanation. Observers could pinpoint it neither geographically nor temporally. Yet its presence was undeniable, cutting across the frozen landscape like a message carried on invisible currents. The sound traveled over miles of snow-laden spruce and birch, cutting through the Arctic stillness in ways that seemed impossible given the dense forest and rolling topography of the region. Valleys, riverbeds, and frozen wetlands all seemed equally permeable to its passage, and no natural barrier appeared to diminish its audibility. The expansive terrain, which often muffled other noises, seemed to amplify this lone whistle, giving it a clarity and purity that both fascinated and unsettled those who heard it. The boreal forest vastness, normally isolating and quiet, became a conduit for a mystery that spanned distances far greater than any human observer could traverse. Individuals traveling the frozen trails and air routes around Hustler recounted hearing the whistle at unpredictable hours, describing a tone so consistent it lingered in memory long after it faded. Bush pilots flying supply runs would report the sound drifting across valleys while the skies remained clear, and trappers in remote cabins noted it weaving in and out of the surrounding woods, sometimes from the north, sometimes from the west, with no discernible source. Each testimony shared a similar astonishment, a single unwavering note that seemed to exist independently of the observer, a sound that could be both intimate and impossibly distant at once. The whistle's pitch remained sharp and flute-like, carrying above ambient wind and forest noise, while its duration varied unpredictably from a brief trill to a prolonged echoing note that lingered long after the source had vanished. Some accounts described subtle variations in tone, as if the sound were modulating in ways too precise for wind or wildlife to reproduce. At times it would end abruptly, leaving the listener with a silence heavier than the surrounding forest, only to re-emerge minutes later in a distant part of the landscape. Its audibility over snow fields, frozen lakes, and conifer-covered hills suggested a propagation mechanism that confounded both intuition and scientific understanding. Field teams equipped with portable microphones and recording instruments attempted to trace the sound, yet repeated measurements revealed no identifiable origin, leaving researchers baffled. Efforts included triangulation across multiple villages, remote sensing, and acoustic mapping, all of which returned inconclusive or contradictory data. Some devices detected the whistle as coming from one direction, only for the next recording to indicate an entirely different source, implying either rapid movement or a phenomenon beyond conventional comprehension. Even high-frequency and long-range equipment failed to isolate the cause, underscoring the sound's enigmatic quality. Stationed amid the trees, explorers reported an uneasy fascination, noting the whistle as both near and distant, an ephemeral presence that subtly warped focus and perception. Sleep-deprived trappers reported feeling its resonance inside their heads, a sensation that bordered on discomfort or anxiety, while pilots recounted episodes of intense concentration and disorientation when attempting to track the sound from the air. Over time, the whistle became more than a curiosity. It assumed the character of an unknown companion, an invisible entity threading through the Arctic silence, present yet untouchable. Snow cover, frozen riverbeds, and atmospheric temperature inversion seemed to affect the whistle's audibility, amplifying or muffling it without revealing a pattern, heightening the impression of an elusive source. In certain conditions, the note would carry farther than expected, echoing across ridges and valleys as though channeled by unseen forces, while in others, it would vanish entirely despite no observable change in environmental conditions. Investigators documented these variations, noting correlations with snow density and temperature gradients. Yet no predictive model could explain the sound's behavior, reinforcing its unpredictable and spectral nature. Experts in animals, geology, and atmospheric science examined the phenomenon, but found no evidence of birds, wolves, seismic activity, or unusual air currents capable of producing such sustained musical tones. Geologists dismissed any suggestion of rock or ice resonance, while meteorologists could not link it to temperature inversions, auroras, or wind patterns. Biologists ruled out migratory or resident wildlife as the pitch, duration, and propagation exceeded known capacities. Each conventional theory collapsed under scrutiny, leaving a mystery that straddled the border between natural and inexplicable. Early settler diaries and explorer journals offered vague references to mysterious winds or unaccountable sounds, which might now be connected to the persistent Arctic whistle. Anecdotal accounts spoke of singing airs or ghostly calls drifting across the tundra, but these were dismissed as folklore or exaggeration until modern recordings confirmed their authenticity. The whistle's continuity over decades, spanning towns and uninhabited stretches of forest alike, suggested a phenomenon that had persisted beyond human memory, quietly threading through the landscape without ever being contained or explained. Field notes indicated that the whistle could be heard across distant settlements, sometimes simultaneously, and could vanish for hours, only to reappear in an entirely different section of the Boreal Forest, defying any attempt at patterning. Its recurrence did not align with human schedules, animal behavior, or environmental triggers, leaving listeners to rely solely on the raw experience of hearing it. In a place where the forest dominates all perception, the whistle became both a landmark and a puzzle, a sound unnamed from any anchor in the physical world. Continuous monitoring and repeated recording attempts produced no explanation, leaving a tension between meticulous analysis and the stubborn mystery echoing through the forest. Every investigation seemed to confirm the same paradox. The sound was real, measurable, and yet untraceable. It existed on the edge of comprehension. Tangible enough to provoke study, but intangible enough to resist definition. An enduring signal threading through the Arctic boreal interior like a secret the land itself refused to reveal. The endless whistle drifted over the frozen forests, a note without origin, weaving through the Arctic night as though the land itself had learned to hum a secret music.